Emma Dawson slammed her mother's recipe book down on William Carter's kitchen table so hard the flour jar rattled off the shelf and shattered across the floor. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was set. And every man in that room went completely still. "You want to send me away?" she said. "Then look me in the eye when you do it. If this story already has your heart, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss a single story. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels." Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened at Carter Ranch in the summer of 1885 is something nobody in that county ever forgot. The letter had promised work. It had not promised dignity, and Emma Dawson had learned long ago not to expect what wasn't written down. She had read the words 3 times by lamplight in her rented room in Billings, running her finger over each line as if the paper itself might change its mind and take the offer back before morning. Seeking experienced cook. Carter Ranch, Millhaven County, Montana Territory. Room and wages provided. Inquire by post or arrival. That was all. No name beyond Carter. No promise of welcome. No description of the kitchen or the hours or how many mouths needed feeding. Just work and wages and Montana, which was more than Emma had at that moment. So she folded the letter into her coat pocket, counted the coins left in her mother's old tea tin, and bought a ticket on the next northbound stage. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she wasn't running. She told herself a lot of things during that long, rattling ride through dry hills and open sky, watching the land grow wilder and more indifferent the further they traveled from anything resembling a town. But the truth sat quiet beside her the whole way, the way truth always does when you're too tired to argue with it anymore. She was 27 years old. She had no family left. She had no restaurant. She had no savings worth speaking of, no husband, no prospects. And 3 people in Billings had told her in the span of one single week that a woman of her size had no business applying for serious kitchen work. 3 people. One of them had been a woman. Emma had smiled at all 3 of them with the particular smile she had perfected over years of practice. The one that looked gracious from the outside, but said something entirely different underneath. And she had walked away each time with her mother's recipe book tucked under her arm like a shield. The recipe book was the last thing she owned that had belonged to her mother. It was thick and battered, and the cover had warped from years of kitchen steam, and the pages inside were covered in her mother's small, precise handwriting, with corrections and additions and little notes in the margins that Emma had memorized so completely she could have recited them in her sleep. Add more salt than you think. Let the onions go longer than they want to. A good broth is not made in an hour. Patience is an ingredient. Her mother had built a small restaurant in eastern Colorado out of nothing but those recipes and 30 years of stubbornness. Emma had grown up in that kitchen, learning to cook the way other children learn to read. Slowly at first, then all at once, until it became as natural as breathing. She had expected to spend her life there. Then the drought came. Then the loans came due. Then the bank took everything in a single afternoon while Emma stood on the sidewalk outside with the recipe book in her arms and watched strangers carry out her mother's tables. Her mother had died 6 months before that, which was, Emma sometimes thought, the only mercy in the whole ugly business. Her mother never had to see the end of what she'd built. Emma had grieved both losses at the same time, the woman and the kitchen. And then she had gotten up and started looking for work. Because grief was a thing you carried with you, not a thing you sat down inside of. She had learned that from her mother, too. The stage pulled into Millhaven just before noon on a Tuesday in July, and the heat that pressed down on that little Montana town was the specific, dry, relentless heat of a place that has given up apologizing for itself. Emma climbed down from the stage with her suitcase in one hand and her recipe book in the other, and she stood in the road for a moment and looked around. Millhaven was not a pretty town. It had the look of a place that had expected more to happen to it and was still waiting for the disappointment to fully arrive. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that looked like it leaned slightly to the left, and a church that looked like it was trying to balance things out by leaning slightly to the right. A few people moved along the wooden sidewalks on either side of the main street. and several of them looked at Emma as she stood there in the road. She was used to being looked at. She was a large woman, had been since childhood, would be until she died, and had made her peace with that fact sometime around her 19th birthday, when she'd realized that the peace was something she'd have to make herself, because nobody else was going to offer it to her. She wore a plain brown dress that had been washed enough times to go soft, and her dark hair was pinned up under a hat that had seen better days, and she stood straight with her shoulders square, because her mother had told her 100 times that the way you carry yourself is the first story you tell about who you are, and Emma intended to tell that story clearly. She asked at the livery for directions to Carter Ranch. The man there gave her directions, and then gave her a look that said he didn't think much of her chances, but kept his opinion where it belonged, inside his own head, which Emma considered a point in Millhaven's favor. It was 4 miles out to the ranch. She hired a boy with a cart to take her and her suitcase, and she rode the last stretch, looking out at the land opening up around her. The dry grass, the mountains blue and distant to the west, the wide sky that felt like it belonged to a different and larger world than the one she'd been living in. There was something about Montana that made her feel very small and very free at the same time, and she wasn't sure yet whether she liked that feeling or not. Carter Ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt road, and it was bigger than she'd expected. There were several outbuildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse, and a main house that was solidly built and had once been well kept and showed the signs of having been neglected for long enough that the neglect had started to become its own kind of character. Horses moved in a corral to one side. Men moved between buildings with the particular economy of motion that meant hard work and not enough hours in the day, and several of those men stopped what they were doing when the cart came through the gate. Emma climbed down, paid the boy, and picked up her suitcase and her recipe book. She could feel them watching. She could feel the specific quality of their attention, the quick assessment, the conclusion drawn before a single word was spoken. And she breathed through it the way she always did, the way her mother had taught her. Let them look. What they see in the first moment is their own business. What they know after an hour, that's yours. A man came out of this barn. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that doesn't seem like it's making an effort. And he wore dust-colored clothing and a hat pulled low against the sun. And he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent so long doing hard work that his body had stopped remembering how to move any other way. He was somewhere around 40, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something angular and watchful, and he looked at Emma the way a man looks at something he is trying to determine the use of. This was William Carter. Emma knew it before he spoke. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and Emma looked back at him and didn't move. "You're here about the cook position," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I am," Emma said. He looked at her. He looked at the recipe book. He looked at the suitcase. Something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely read. Not dismissal exactly, but close to it. The kind of look that meant his mind was already making a decision his mouth hadn't caught up to yet. "You think you can feed 30 ranch hands?" he asked. Emma set her suitcase down on the ground. She placed her mother's recipe book on the low fence post nearest to her, with the same deliberateness you'd place something valuable. And she looked at William Carter with the particular steadiness she had developed over years of being underestimated by people who were about to be wrong. "I don't think," she said. "I know." He studied her for another moment. She could see him weighing it, whatever he was weighing. She didn't look away. She had learned that looking away was the first concession, and the first concession always led to more. "Come inside," he finally said, and turned back toward the main house. Emma picked up her recipe book and her suitcase and followed him. Behind her, she heard one of the cowboys say something low to another, and she heard the other one laugh. She didn't turn around. She had learned that too. The kitchen was a large room at the back of the house, and it was. She assessed it quickly, the way her mother had taught her to assess a kitchen, the way a general assesses a battlefield. Functional, but stripped down. There was a wide iron stove, a good one, solid enough. There were shelves with basic supplies, nothing exceptional. A large work table in the center, scarred from years of use. a window over the basin that looked out toward the barn. It was a kitchen that had been used hard and cared for poorly, and it had the specific sadness of a room that remembered better days. William Carter stood in the doorway while she looked around. "Previous cook left 3 weeks ago," he said. "Men have been making do." "What do you have in the larder?" Emma asked. He told her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had worked with less. "I'll need a few things from town," she said. "Not much, and I'll need the afternoon." "You've got until dinner," William said. 6 o'clock, 31 men. 31, Emma repeated, making the adjustment. "Myself included," he said, and walked away. She stood alone in that kitchen for a moment after he left, and she let herself feel it. The weight of the moment, the knowledge that this was the kind of chance that came once, and that how she handled the next 6 hours would determine everything that followed. She felt the familiar nervousness that always preceded a meal that mattered. And then she felt the familiar thing that came after the nervousness. The thing her mother had always called settling in. The moment when the kitchen stopped being foreign and started being hers. She put on her apron. She opened her mother's recipe book. She got to work. She started with the broth, because the broth was always first, and because a good broth took time and couldn't be hurried, and because her mother had written in the margin next to the recipe, "Everything else is built on this, so build it right." She found a soup bone in the larder and put it on to simmer with onion and salt and a handful of dried herbs that were older than she would have liked, but still had something left in them. The smell began to fill the kitchen almost immediately, and she felt some of the tightness in her shoulders ease. She sent one of the younger cowboys. He'd been lingering near the kitchen door with the pretense of doing something to a piece of harness. Into town with a list and a portion of the wages she'd been promised in advance. He looked surprised to be asked, and then surprised again when she said please, and then he went without argument, which told her something useful about the mood of the ranch in general. While the broth went, she inventoried everything available with the methodical thoroughness her mother had drilled into her. You learned a kitchen by its contents before you learned it by anything else. You understood what you were working with before you decided what you were making. Amateur cooks thought about the dish first. Her mother had always thought about the ingredients first, and Emma had inherited that habit along with the recipe book. By the time the boy came back from town, she had a plan. Not a complicated plan. 31 working men didn't need complicated, didn't want complicated, worked hard all day in the sun, and came to the table wanting something real and filling and good. She was going to give them that. Slow-cooked beef in that broth she'd been building, with root vegetables and herbs. Fresh bread, because bread was the thing that made a meal feel like it meant something. And a simple apple cake from her mother's recipe, because sweetness at the end of a meal told people the evening was a gift, not just a necessity. She worked steadily through the afternoon, alone in that kitchen, and she was aware of the sounds of the ranch around her, the distant voices of men working, the particular rhythms of a place with 30 people in it. And she was aware also of the quiet inside the kitchen itself, and she was comfortable with it. She had always been comfortable alone. Loneliness and solitude were different things, and she had learned to find the difference. Around 4 o'clock, the door to the kitchen opened, and a young cowboy looked in. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a sunburned face and the look of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure whether to say it. Emma looked up from the bread she was shaping. "Can I help you?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said. He paused. "It smells real good in here." "Thank you," Emma said. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Colorado," she said. "And before that, everywhere else." He nodded like that meant something to him. "Me too," he said. Then he left. She thought about that for a while as she worked. At 5:30, William Carter appeared in the kitchen doorway. He didn't come in. He stood in the frame of the door with his arms crossed and watched her work for a moment in silence, and Emma let him watch. She wasn't going to pretend she didn't know he was there, but she also wasn't going to stop what she was doing to manage his comfort. "Smells different in here," he said. "Different from what?" she asked. "Different from how it usually smells," he said. Which wasn't much of an answer, but she understood what he meant. "The bread's almost done," she said. "The beef's been going since 2. It needs another 20 minutes. I didn't say anything. "You can come in if you want," she said. "Or you can come back at 6. He came in. He sat down at the work table, which surprised her. Most men in his position would have stayed standing, would have kept the physical advantage of height. He sat and he watched her work, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who are sizing each other up honestly, without pretense. "How long you been cooking?" he asked after a while. "Since I was 6, she said. "Your mother teach you?" She glanced at him. "She did." "Where is she now?" "Gone," Emma said. 8 months. He was quiet. Then, "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. And she meant it, because sorry was sometimes all there was, and at least he'd said it. "Your father?" he asked. "Never knew him." Another silence. "The restaurant in the letter," he said. "The one you owned." "Lost it," Emma said. She didn't elaborate. The story was her own, and she wasn't going to lay it out for someone who hadn't earned it yet. He seemed to understand that, because he didn't ask more. "The men," he said instead, after a moment. "They're not an easy lot. They've had 3 cooks in 2 years. First one couldn't handle the hours. Second one burned everything. Third one—" He stopped. "Third one what?" Emma asked. "Couldn't get along," William said. He said it in a way that made her suspect that wasn't the complete story, but she let it go. She would learn what she needed to learn. "I'm not here to get along," Emma said. She pulled the bread from the oven and set it on the table between them, and the smell that came off it filled the whole kitchen with something warm and immediate and good. "I'm here to cook." William looked at the bread. Something shifted in his face. A small thing. A thing she might have missed if she hadn't been watching. A loosening, barely perceptible, around the edges of his jaw. "That," he said, more quietly than his previous words, "smells like something." "Wait until you taste it," Emma said. At 6 o'clock, the men came in. She heard them before she saw them. The boots on the wooden floor, the voices, the particular noise of a large group of tired men entering a room with low expectations. She had the beef in the big serving dish on the table, the bread sliced and laid out, the vegetables alongside, the cake covered at the end of the spread. She stood back by the stove the way her mother had always stood. Not presenting herself, not performing, just present, watching to see what would happen. The first man through the door stopped. Not because she told him to, not because anything visible made him stop. He just stopped and stood there in the doorway, and the man behind him walked into his back. "Move, Hector," the second man said. "You smell that?" Hector said. "Move," the second man said again, but slower this time, because he'd smelled it too. They came through and they stopped, and they looked at the spread on the table, and the silence that fell over that dining room was the specific silence Emma had been hoping for. Not the silence of reluctance or suspicion, but the silence of people who have been surprised by something good and need a moment to let themselves believe it. The young cowboy from the kitchen doorway found her eyes from across the room. He gave her a small, quick nod, as if something had been confirmed. The men sat. They served themselves. And then they ate. Emma watched from beside the stove, arms folded, and she watched not just the eating, but the changing. The way shoulders that had been set with exhaustion began to drop. The way voices that had come intense began to soften. The way the conversation that started slowly began to gather itself into something real. Stories came out. Names she would learn later. Laughter, low at first, then genuine. She watched a man at the far end of the table wipe his mouth with the back of his hand and sit back and look at the ceiling for a moment, with the specific expression of someone who has just been reminded of something they had stopped expecting. She watched another man reach for a second piece of bread without looking, because his attention was on the story the man across from him was telling, and the automatic reach of someone comfortable, the body knowing it wanted more before the mind caught up, was its own kind of testament. She watched William Carter. He had taken a seat at the head of the table, as she'd expected. He served himself without ceremony, and he ate without making a show of it. and she watched him take the first bite of the beef, and she saw the moment it landed. She knew that moment. She had seen it on 100 faces in her mother's restaurant, on her mother's own face when a recipe finally worked the way it was supposed to. The moment when the body overrides the mind and just responds. His expression didn't change dramatically. He wasn't the kind of man whose expression changed dramatically. But there was a pause, a fraction of a second between the first bite and whatever was going to come next. A fraction of a second in which something happened behind his eyes that he clearly hadn't been planning on. And then he looked up. He looked directly at her. She looked back. He set down his fork. The room around him was full of noise and motion, men talking and eating and reaching across each other. The meal doing exactly what a meal is supposed to do, making people feel like they are somewhere and not just anywhere. But William Carter sat at the head of it all and looked at Emma Dawson across the length of the dining room with an expression she hadn't seen on his face yet and wasn't sure she'd ever see on it again. He looked confused, and something under the confusion that she couldn't name yet. He pushed back from the table and stood up, and he walked the length of the dining room without speaking to anyone, and the men who noticed him move didn't remark on it because he was a man who moved according to his own reasoning, and they had all learned not to question it. He walked to where Emma stood by the stove. He stopped in front of her. He wasn't more than 2 feet away, which was closer than he'd come to her all afternoon. He looked at her for a long moment. And then William Carter, the hardest man in Millhaven County, who had not shown genuine surprise in longer than he could probably remember, said the words that Emma Dawson would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "Who are you?" He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says something when he's not performing for anyone, when the words are coming out of someplace real. Emma looked at him. She could hear the room behind him, the noise, the laughter. 30 men made temporarily comfortable in their own lives by something she had built that afternoon in an unfamiliar kitchen with old recipes and patience and the understanding her mother had given her about what food was really for. "Someone who knows," she said, "that people are more than their hunger." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The position is yours. Permanent. If you want it." Emma nodded once. "I want it." He nodded back. And then he returned to his seat. That night, long after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and the dining room was empty, and Emma was alone in the kitchen cleaning up, she opened her mother's recipe book to a fresh page in the back, a page she had been saving without knowing what for. And she wrote a single line in her own handwriting. Millhaven, Montana, July 1885. First dinner. They stayed at the table. Then she closed the book, and she finished cleaning the kitchen, and she looked at the stove that was no longer warm, and the shelves she was already calculating how to restock, and the window that showed nothing but dark Montana sky. She thought, "I am not running anymore." She thought, "I am here," and she turned out the lamp, and she went to find her room, and she did not know yet everything that was going to happen. The trouble coming, the fights ahead, the things she would learn about William Carter, and the things he would learn about her. The way 2 people who have survived great damage sometimes find each other without meaning to. She did not know any of that yet. But she had made 31 men stay at the table, and one of them had looked at her like he had never seen anything before that surprised him. That was enough, for one night, to carry her into sleep. Emma had been at Carter Ranch for exactly 9 days when she learned that not everyone was going to let her stay quietly. The morning started like every other morning had started. Before first light, before anyone else was moving, Emma was in the kitchen with the stove going and the coffee on, and her mother's recipe book open on the work table beside her. She had learned in those 9 days that the ranch woke up in a particular order. The horses first, moving in the corral. Then the older hands, the ones whose bodies had given up on sleeping past 4. Then the younger men, dragging themselves out of the bunkhouse with the specific reluctance of people who haven't yet made their peace with early hours. And last, almost always last, but never after anyone had started working, William Carter. She had learned other things too. She had learned that a cowboy named Pete Harlow took his coffee with too much sugar and was embarrassed about it. She had learned that the oldest hand on the ranch, a weathered man everyone called Doc, who had no medical training whatsoever, had a bad knee that made him wince when the weather changed and never mentioned it. She had learned that the young cowboy who'd stood in her kitchen doorway the first afternoon was named Jesse, and that he was 19 years old and had come to Montana from Georgia looking for something he couldn't quite name yet, which Emma privately thought was the most honest reason anyone ever went anywhere. She had learned that William Carter took his coffee black and his meals in silence, and thanked her for neither, which she did not take personally, because she had also learned that he thanked nobody for anything, and that this was not rudeness exactly, but the particular self-sufficiency of a man who had spent so long alone inside himself that he had forgotten there were things worth thanking people for. What she had not learned yet, and what she was about to, was that there was a man on that ranch who had decided her presence was a problem. His name was Roy Briggs, and she had noticed him on her first day the way you notice a stone in your boot, not because it announces itself, but because of the way it makes every step slightly wrong. He was the ranch's oldest and most senior hand, second only to William in terms of influence over the other men, and he had been at Carter Ranch for 11 years, and he had strong opinions about how things should be done, and apparently one of those opinions was that Emma Dawson should not be there. She had seen him at the edge of the dining room that first night, the only man who hadn't finished what was on his plate. She had seen the way he watched her when she moved through the ranch to get supplies from the storeroom, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and the expression of a man who has decided something and is waiting for events to confirm him. She had not spoken to him directly. She had been waiting to understand the shape of the problem before she decided what to do about it. That morning, on the 9th day, he came to the kitchen door while she was in the middle of making breakfast for 31 men. "You're in my way," he said. Emma looked up from the skillet she was managing. She had 3 things on the stove simultaneously, and the bread in the oven, and timing that depended on not being interrupted, and she said, "Good morning, Mr. Briggs." "Carter made a mistake hiring you," Roy Briggs said. Emma turned the bacon without looking at him. "You're welcome to take that up with Mr. Carter." "I'm taking it up with you," he said. He stepped into the kitchen uninvited, which already told her what kind of conversation this was going to be. "We had a system before you came. Men knew what to expect." "They knew to expect burned food and cold coffee," Emma said calmly. "I've heard about the previous arrangements." "The previous cook didn't think she was better than everyone." Emma set down her spatula. She turned around and she looked at Roy Briggs directly, which she had the impression he hadn't expected, because he shifted his weight slightly. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I have got eggs on the skillet, bread in the oven, and 30 men who are going to walk through that door in 20 minutes. Whatever point you're trying to make, I need you to make it faster or come back after breakfast." His face went a darker shade. "You think because Carter let you stay that you belong here?" "I think," Emma said, "that I have a job to do, and right now you're standing between me and the stove." She picked up her spatula, turned back to the skillet, and kept working. For a moment, nothing happened. She could feel him standing there behind her, and she kept her back straight and her movement steady, and she waited for whatever he was going to do next. Either he was going to do something, or he was going to leave. Those were the only 2 options. He left, but not before he said, low and flat, "Women like you don't last out here." Emma didn't answer. She heard his boots cross the kitchen floor and the door open and close. And then she was alone again with the skillet and the bread and the particular quiet of a threat that had been made and heard and filed away for later. She finished breakfast. She served it at 6, same as every morning. The men came in, sat down, ate. Jesse paused at the end of the serving table and looked at her with the quick attentiveness of the young and said, "You all right this morning, Miss Emma?" "Fine," she said. "Eat before it gets cold." He ate. She watched the room, the way she always did, and she saw Roy Briggs at the far end of the table, eating with the deliberate performance of a man who wanted to appear unbothered and wasn't entirely succeeding at it. She saw 2 of the men near him exchange a look when they thought she wasn't watching. She noted all of it, and she set it aside, and she went back to work. William Carter found her in the kitchen after breakfast, when the dining room had cleared and she was washing up. He came in without knocking. He never knocked, it was his house. and he stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, which she had already learned was something he did when he was about to say something that required him to think about how to say it. She waited. "Roy Briggs talked to you this morning?" he asked. Emma looked up from the basin. "He did." "What did he say?" "That you made a mistake hiring me. That I don't belong here. The usual." She dried her hands on her apron. "Nothing I haven't heard before." William was quiet for a moment. "Roy's been here a long time." "I know," Emma said. "He's not a bad man." "I didn't say he was," Emma said. "I said he told me I don't belong here. Those aren't the same thing." William's jaw worked. She could see him weighing something. "I'll talk to him," he said. "You don't have to," Emma said. "I can manage Roy Briggs." Something moved across his face. "Can you?" "I managed 3 men in Billings who told me the same thing," Emma said. "And I managed the bank that took my mother's restaurant. I'm not worried about one cowboy with wounded pride." She turned back to the basin. "But thank you for asking." He stood there a moment longer, turning his hat. Then, "The bread this morning." She glanced at him. "That was—" He stopped, started again. "The men are working better," he said finally. "Since you came, I noticed these things." It wasn't what he'd started to say. She knew that. But she also knew that sometimes a man got as far as he could get in a single moment, and it wasn't her job to push him further than he was ready to go. "That's good to hear," she said. He put his hat back on and walked out. Emma stood at the basin and looked out the window at the barn and the mountains beyond it, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel the warmth of what he'd said. "Men are working better since you came," before she turned back to the work. 30 seconds was what her mother had always allowed herself for satisfaction. Any more than that, and you started expecting it, and expectation was the beginning of disappointment. The trouble with Roy Briggs did not go away after William spoke to him. Whatever William said, and Emma never asked, it was not the kind of thing that resolved Roy's particular brand of resentment, which had its roots somewhere deeper than anything a single conversation was going to reach. What changed was only the form it took. It went from open to quiet, which was in some ways worse, because quiet trouble was harder to address. She noticed food going missing from the storeroom. Not much, and never enough to be certain, but enough that she had to adjust what she was planning, and then explain the adjustment in a way that didn't point fingers she couldn't prove. She noticed that the wood for the stove was sometimes left in worse condition than it should have been, split badly or wet, so that her fires took longer to come up to heat and the timing of her meals suffered. She noticed small things, accumulated, that she could not individually name as sabotage, but that together had the texture of it. She said nothing to William. She adapted. She adjusted her orders from the store in town to account for the shortages. She started her fires earlier to compensate for the wood. She kept her own counsel, and she did her job, and she watched. And then one afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrival, she found something she could name. She had gone to the larder for a crock of lard she'd stored the day before, and it wasn't there. In its place was an empty shelf and a smear on the wood that told her the crock had been there and then hadn't. She stood in the larder door for a moment, calculating. Dinner was in 3 hours. She had already begun preparations that depended on what was now missing. She could adjust. She had adjusted before, could always adjust. But the adjustment would require ingredients she didn't currently have, and getting them meant either sending someone to town or going herself. She went to find Jesse. He was behind the barn doing something to a saddle, and he looked up when she came around the corner with the expression of a young man who had learned, over 2 weeks, to read Emma Dawson's face well enough to know when something was wrong. "I need to go to town," she said. "I'll be back by 4. Can you watch the stove?" "Watch it how?" he asked warily. "Don't let it go out," she said. "That's all. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Should I tell anyone where you went?" She thought about that. "Tell Mr. Carter if he asks," she said. "Don't tell anyone else." Jesse nodded, with the look of someone who understood more than was being said to him. She walked the 4 miles to town, bought what she needed, and walked back. It took 2.5 hours. She came in through the kitchen door at 10 minutes past 4, and Jesse was sitting beside the stove with his hat in his lap and the fire exactly as she'd left it. And he stood up when she came in and said, "Nobody bothered anything," in a way that confirmed he had suspected someone might try. "Thank you, Jesse," she said. "Miss Emma," he said, pausing at the door. "I know it ain't my business." "But," she said. "Briggs was in the kitchen while you were gone," he said. "Looking for something, I think. I told him I was watching the stove for you, and he said something I won't repeat to a lady, and then he left." Emma set her basket on the work table. "Thank you," she said again. "You going to tell Carter?" Jesse asked. Emma was quiet for a moment. "Not yet," she said. "Go on and get cleaned up for dinner." She cooked the meal she'd planned with the things she'd walked 8 miles round trip to get, and she served it at 6, and it was good. It was always good. That was the one thing Roy Briggs hadn't figured out how to take from her: the cooking itself. What happened next happened fast, the way things always do when they've been building slowly. She was in the kitchen after dinner, the dining room mostly cleared, when she heard raised voices from somewhere near the barn. She couldn't make out words, just the specific tone of men arguing about something that had gone past reason and into something older. She dried her hands and walked to the kitchen door and opened it. William Carter and Roy Briggs were standing in the open space between the house and the barn, and 4 or 5 other men were standing at a distance, the way men stand when they've decided not to get in the middle of something, but aren't willing to walk away from it either. She couldn't hear the whole thing. She caught pieces. Roy's voice, flat and certain. "Half the supply order off the last bill doesn't add up, and we both know why." And William's voice, lower and harder. "That's a serious thing to say, Roy." And Roy again. "I'm not the only one thinking it." Emma understood in 3 seconds what was happening. He was implying she had been stealing from the ranch's accounts. She was walking before she made the decision to walk. She crossed the yard and came to stand beside William, and the men who'd been watching shifted and rearranged themselves. And Roy Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a calculated move and is confident in it. "You have something to say to me," Emma said. "Say it to me." Roy Briggs looked at William. "You see how she does that?" he said. "Just comes out and inserts herself." "Say it to me," Emma said again. "Not to him, to me." Roy looked at her then, with the full weight of his contempt, and said, "The supply bills have been running high since you came. Things go missing, and Carter's got his head so turned around he won't see what's right in front of him." "The supply bills have been running high," Emma said, "because I've been replacing things that were taken from the larder without being recorded. I've kept the receipts, every single one. Would you like to see them?" Something changed in his face, just slightly. "Because I can get them right now," Emma said. "And we can go through them together, line by line, and you can show me where the discrepancy is." The yard was very quiet. William Carter turned and looked at Roy Briggs with the specific look of a man who has just understood something he should have understood sooner, and it was not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of. Roy Briggs said nothing. "That's what I thought," Emma said. She turned and walked back to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she got back through the door, and she gripped the edge of the work table and breathed through it, because she was allowed to shake, just not in front of them. Never in front of them. That was one of her rules. She heard boots behind her and turned. William had followed her. He came into the kitchen and stood there looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something uncertain at its edges, not quite apology, but neighboring it. "I should have dealt with that sooner," he said. "Yes," Emma said. "You should have." He blinked. She suspected not many people talked to him that directly. "I didn't know about the larder," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "I didn't tell you." "Why?" "Because I wanted to handle it myself," she said. "And because I didn't know yet if you were the kind of man who would believe me." She looked at him steadily. "Now I know." He was quiet for a long moment. "The receipts," he said. "You really kept all of them?" "Everyone," Emma said. "Since the first week. My mother taught me that in a situation where someone might question your honesty, documentation is better than argument." She crossed to the small shelf above the work table, where she kept her personal things, and took down a worn envelope and put it in front of him. He looked at it, but didn't open it. "She sounds like she was a practical woman," he said. "She was," Emma said. He picked up the envelope, turned it in his hands once, and then set it back down. "I'll deal with Roy," he said. "I know," Emma said. He turned to leave, and then stopped. He stood with his back to her for a moment, which she thought was interesting. The things people said with their backs turned were sometimes more true than what they said face to face. "It wasn't right," he said. "What he did, what he said." "No," Emma agreed. "It wasn't." "You didn't deserve that." She said nothing. She understood that he was not apologizing on Roy's behalf. He was saying something about himself, about his own delayed reckoning with what had been happening under his roof. "Thank you for staying," he said finally, "is what I mean." Then he walked out. Emma stood alone in the kitchen and looked at the stove and listened to the ranch settling into its evening sounds. And she thought about what staying meant. The choice of it, the cost of it, the particular stubbornness required to stay somewhere that wasn't made for you until it became somewhere that was. She thought about her mother, who had stayed in a small Colorado town and built something where there was nothing, and who had never once, in Emma's hearing, complained about the difficulty of that. She opened her mother's recipe book to the page she'd written on 9 days ago. Millhaven, Montana, July 1885. First dinner. They stayed at the table. She took out her pencil and added a line beneath it. Day 16. I stayed. She closed the book and started on the preparations for tomorrow's breakfast. What she did not know yet, what she couldn't have known, was that Roy Briggs, before leaving the yard that evening, had said something to one of the other men who sometimes rode into Millhaven on weekends. Something about Emma Dawson and her receipts and the questions she'd asked, and the particular way William Carter had followed her into the kitchen, and that man had mentioned it, later that week, in the saloon in Millhaven, to a man who was not a ranch hand at all, a man who dressed too well for a cowboy and too rough for a businessman, who had been asking quiet questions about Carter Ranch for months, and who listened to this new piece of information with the careful attention of someone adding it to a collection. Emma didn't know any of that yet. She knew the stove, and the recipe book, and the sound of the ranch at night, and the particular quality of William Carter's silence as it slowly, barely, began to change. The nights were what surprised her. She had expected the days to be hard. The work, the Roy Briggs problem, the physical demands of feeding 31 people 3 times a day with limited resources. She had prepared herself for all of that. What she hadn't prepared for was the quiet of the nights, and the way the quiet brought things up from inside her that she spent the days keeping down. She missed her mother with a ferocity that occasionally caught her off guard. Not the gentle, resigned kind of missing that she'd expected grief to settle into eventually, but the sudden sharp kind, the kind that arrived without warning while she was doing something ordinary, rolling dough or checking the fire or writing in her notebook. The kind that felt less like sadness and more like the abrupt awareness of an absence, of a space where a person used to be, a voice that used to be there and wasn't anymore. She cried sometimes, on those nights. Quietly, alone, with the lamp turned low. She allowed herself that, the same way she allowed herself 30 seconds of satisfaction. Because her mother had also taught her that grief unexpressed had a way of expressing itself sideways, in anger or brittleness, or the kind of low-grade sadness that colored everything without ever quite explaining itself, and it was better to let it out directly and then put it away. She didn't know that on the 3rd week, William Carter heard her. He told her later, much later, that he had come down to check the stove because one of the flues sometimes stuck, and there had been a smell of smoke in the hallway. That he had stood outside the kitchen door and heard the quiet sound of her crying, and had stood there with his hand raised to knock and then not knocked, because he didn't know what to say, and it seemed to him that intruding on a private grief was worse than leaving it alone. He stood there for a while, he said, and then he went back upstairs. But the next morning, there was a small bunch of wildflowers on the kitchen work table when she came down before first light. No note, just the flowers, left there by someone who had gone out in the early dark to find them and hadn't wanted credit for the finding. Emma stood and looked at them for a long moment. Then she put them in a glass of water and set them on the windowsill where she could see them while she worked. She never asked him about it. He never mentioned it. But something between them shifted again, slight and slow. The way ground shifts when frost begins to thaw. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that you start stepping differently. Jesse noticed. He noticed everything, that boy. Another thing Emma had come to appreciate about him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway one morning that week and looked at the flowers on the windowsill and then at Emma. And then he looked at his own boots with great deliberateness, and Emma said, "Don't." "I didn't say anything," Jesse said. "You were about to say something," Emma said. "I was about to say the kitchen looks nice," Jesse said. "Go get me more firewood." "Yes, ma'am," he said, with a grin he mostly contained. She shook her head and turned back to the stove. But the truth was that something was changing in the house itself, not just between her and William, but in the whole texture of the place. The dining room was different. She could feel it every evening, the way the men sat, the way they talked, the way a meal had become an event they were present for, rather than just a necessity they got through. She heard them laughing more, heard them argue less, heard the particular sounds of people who have been reminded that they are in community with one another and have started to act accordingly. Doc's knee had been bad that week. She knew without being told. She saw it in the way he moved between the barn and the bunkhouse, the way he lowered himself into his chair at dinner with the extra care of someone managing pain. She made a broth that night that her mother had always made for aching joints. Not medicine, just good bone stock with the right herbs, warm through to the center of you. And she set it in front of him without comment. He looked at the bowl and then looked at her. "Drink it," she said. "It'll help." He drank it. The next morning, when she saw him crossing the yard, he was moving easier. He didn't say anything to her directly, but he took off his hat when he passed the kitchen window, and that was enough. It was on the 24th day that William Carter first came to the kitchen of his own accord. Not for a reason, not to ask about supplies or discuss a problem, but just because. She was working after dinner, the ranch gone quiet around her, going through her mother's recipe book and thinking about what to make on Sunday when she could do something more elaborate than the weekday meals demanded. She heard his step in the hallway and knew it was his. She had learned all their steps by now, the whole ranch, the way you learn the rhythms of any place you intend to stay in. And when he appeared in the doorway, she looked up and waited. He stood there for a moment like a man who has had a reason and mislaid it somewhere on the way to the door. "I was passing," he said. She said nothing. He came in and sat down at the work table, same as he had on that first day before dinner, and he looked at the recipe book open in front of her. "What are you planning?" he asked. "Sunday," she said. "I was thinking baked chicken. Might do a proper pie if the fruit order comes in." He nodded. "The men would appreciate that." "I know," she said. A pause. "That book," he said, looking at the recipe book. "It was your mother's?" "She started it," Emma said. "I've been adding to it since I was a girl. Can I?" He stopped, looked uncertain, which was an expression she was seeing more of on him, and which she found she liked considerably better than the blank certainty he'd started with. "May I look at it?" She turned it and slid it across the work table to him. He picked it up carefully, which was the right instinct, she thought, the instinct of someone who understood that other people's valuable things deserved to be handled with care. And he looked at the first pages, the ones in her mother's handwriting, slowly. "She had good handwriting," he said. "She said it was a form of respect," Emma said, "for what you were writing down." He turned a few more pages. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did now. The thing that she was beginning to understand was not blankness, but quiet. The face of a man who was feeling something and hadn't yet decided whether he was allowed to. "My wife used to cook," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned her. Emma kept her expression neutral, giving him the space the statement required. "She was—" He stopped, started again. "She wasn't much for recipes. She did it by instinct. Everything she made was different every time, and it was always good." He was quiet for a moment. "When she died, I couldn't." He set the recipe book down on the table with the same care he'd picked it up with. I stopped expecting food to be anything." "I know," Emma said softly. He looked at her. "How?" "Because of the kitchen," she said. "When I arrived, the kitchen had the feeling of a room that someone had given up on." She paused. "I've seen that before. In houses where something went wrong. The kitchen goes first, because the kitchen is where people used to—" She looked for the word, "show up for each other." William Carter looked at the recipe book on the table between them for a long time. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "My wife." His voice was careful and deliberate, the way a man's voice is careful when he's not sure the words will survive being spoken aloud. She liked people who didn't make excuses for themselves. Emma said, "Thank you." And she meant it in a way that went deeper than the words. He nodded once, pushed back from the table, and stood up. "The chicken sundae," he said, returning to practicality the way a man will when the emotional ground has gotten further than he planned. "Is there anything you need for it that we don't have?" "I'll put together a list," Emma said. "Leave it on the table," he said. "I'll take care of it." He walked out. Emma sat alone in this kitchen with her mother's recipe book and the quiet of the ranch at night, and she listened to his footsteps going back down the hall, and she thought about what he'd said. "She would have liked you." And she let that sit inside her for a moment. The warmth of it. The particular quality of being seen by someone who had not expected to see you. Then she picked up her pencil and opened the book to the back pages, and she wrote, "Day 24. He sat at the table. He stayed. She closed the book. Outside, the Montana night was wide and dark and full of stars, and somewhere to the north of Millhaven, a man in a well-pressed suit was adding what he'd heard about Carter Ranch to a ledger of his own, calculating, measuring, deciding that the time to move was getting close. But inside the kitchen of Carter Ranch, Emma Dawson banked the fire for the night and checked the list she was making for Sunday's chicken, and allowed herself to believe, for the first time since she had arrived, that staying somewhere long enough could make it yours. She had been there 24 days. She didn't know yet that everything was about to get much harder. The Sunday chicken was the best thing Emma had made since arriving at Carter Ranch, and she knew it before she served it. She knew it the way her mother had always known. Not from tasting, though she tasted, but from the smell that built in the kitchen through the afternoon. The specific smell of things coming together correctly, of seasoning and heat and time working in exactly the proportion they were supposed to. She had done the potatoes the way her mother did them on special occasions, roasted with herbs in the chicken drippings, and she had managed a dried apple pie from the last of the fruit order that had come in Thursday, and she had set the table in the dining room herself that morning, which she didn't usually do, because Sunday felt different, and she thought the men deserved something that acknowledged the difference. Jesse had helped her carry the dishes out without being asked, which was how she knew he understood the difference too. The men came in at noon. William had given them Sunday afternoons light, less work, more time to write letters, or rest, or whatever men did when they were briefly released from the constant demands of a working ranch. And when they came through the dining room door, the sound they made was not quite words and not quite silence. It was something in between. The sound of people surprised by something good. Doc sat down and looked at his plate and said quietly, to no one in particular, "Lord have mercy." The man beside him said, "Amen." Emma stood by the stove and felt the warmth of it, the 30 seconds her mother had always allowed. And then she turned back to the kitchen to clean up while they ate. She was at the basin when she heard the dining room door, and she knew before she turned around that it was William, because his step was already as familiar to her as her own. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He had his hat in his hands again. "Emma," he said. She turned. "That meal," he said. He stopped. He looked like a man working against his own inclination to say something, fighting the 11 years of self-sufficient silence that had become his natural condition. It was... He stopped again. "You don't have to explain it," she said. "I want to," he said, which surprised them both, she thought, judging by the expression on his face immediately afterward. He looked at his hat. "My wife made a chicken like that, the first Sunday after we were married. I've thought about that meal." He stopped a third time, and this time the stopping was different. It was the stopping of a man who has gotten somewhere he didn't know he was heading, and isn't sure what to do now that he's arrived. Emma dried her hands on her apron. She gave him the space he needed to finish or not finish, because she had learned that pushing William Carter toward an emotion was like pushing water uphill. You could do it, but it was exhausting for everyone and didn't end well. "You've been here a month," he said finally, which was not what he'd started saying, but was perhaps more honest. "It feels like the ranch has been here the whole time." She understood what that meant. "Thank you," she said, "for the fruit order." "You needed it," he said simply, and put his hat back on, and went back to the dining room. Emma turned back to the basin. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana afternoon was bright and hot and enormous, and the mountains stood in the distance exactly where they always stood, indifferent and permanent. And Emma Dawson washed the pots from Sunday chicken and thought about what it meant to be somewhere long enough that it started to feel like it had always had you in it. She did not know that the following Tuesday was going to change everything. She did not know that the man in the well-pressed suit had ridden out from Millhaven the day before, and that he had stopped at 3 neighboring properties to have 3 separate conversations, and that each of those conversations had ended with a document and a handshake and a quiet, confident smile. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. And she did not know what he wanted, though she would understand that soon enough too. What she knew on Tuesday morning was that William came to breakfast late, which he never did, and that when he came in, he sat down and stared at his coffee without drinking it, and that something had happened to his face in the night. Some tightening, some change in the quality of his silence, from the kind she had gotten used to into something older and harder and less settled. She put a plate in front of him. He looked at it like he'd forgotten what plates were for. "William," she said. He looked up. It was the first time she had used his given name without thinking about it, and she felt the air in the room shift slightly, and the 2 hands nearby, who were still finishing their breakfast, suddenly found reasons to look at their own food very carefully. "Something's wrong," she said. It wasn't a question. He picked up his coffee, put it down. "Got a visit yesterday evening," he said, "from a man called Harlan Driscoll." She didn't know the name. She waited. "He's a land agent," William said, "out of Helena. Says he represents a consortium of investors looking to expand railroad access through this part of the territory." He stopped. "And?" Emma said. "And he has documents," William said, "that he claims give his consortium a prior claim to the water rights on the northern quarter of my land." He said it the way you say something you've been awake all night trying to disprove. "If those documents are legitimate, and he has a judge's seal on them, Emma, a legitimate judge's seal, then the North Pasture is not mine. And without the North Pasture's water, this ranch cannot support the herd. And without the herd—" He stopped. He picked up his coffee again. This time he drank it, the way a man drinks something when he needs something to do with his hands. "Without the herd, there is no ranch." The kitchen was very quiet. "When did he say these documents were filed?" Emma asked. William looked at her. Something in his expression changed. A slight surprise, she thought, at the directness of the question. 1879, he said. 6 years before I bought the land." "Who sold it to you?" she asked. "A man named Alderman," William said. "He died 2 years ago." "And the title search when you bought it, was there any mention of water rights encumbrances?" William put down his coffee very slowly. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the dining room. The confused, unguarded look. The look of someone encountering something they hadn't prepared for. "No," he said. "Then either those documents were filed incorrectly and never properly recorded," Emma said, "or they were created after the fact." She pulled her chair out and sat down across from him at the work table. "Where are your own title documents?" "In the house, in my study." "Have you read them recently?" "No." "Read them," she said. "Today, all of them, and write down every date and every name." She looked at him steadily. "Before you do anything else, before you talk to anyone, before you respond to this Driscoll in any way, read your own papers first." William looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know about title documents?" he said. "My mother lost her restaurant," Emma said simply. "We went through a legal proceeding. I learned things." She paused. I also listened to every conversation in this dining room for a month. Men talk at dinner, William. They say things they think nobody pays attention to. He was very still. What kind of things? He said carefully. Driscoll has been in Millhaven for 6 weeks, Emma said. I didn't know his name until just now, but I knew there was a man asking questions about properties in this county, because Hector mentioned it 3 weeks ago at dinner, and 2 days later, Pete said something about a lawyer type who'd been in the saloon talking to one of the men from the Kendrick place. And last week Doc said the Kendrick property had been sold fast, and the family left in a hurry. She folded her hands on the table. I didn't know what it meant. Now I do. William Carter stared at her. You remembered all that, he said. From dinner conversations. I remember everything that happens in a room I'm feeding, Emma said. My mother taught me that too. You learn what people need by listening to everything they say. Not just to you, all of it. I was quiet for a long time. Outside, the ranch was moving into its morning work. Voices and horses, and the far sound of the corral. All the ordinary sounds of a place that didn't know yet it was under threat. Roy, William said suddenly. Emma waited. Roy's been going to town on weekends, he said. I thought he was just... He stopped. He was the one talking to Driscoll's man in the saloon, wasn't he? It wasn't a question this time. Emma said carefully, I don't know that for certain. But you think it, William said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. William stood up abruptly. The chair scraped back hard across the floor, and the 2 remaining hands in the dining room looked up sharply, and then immediately looked back down. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, very still, and Emma could see the tension in his shoulders, the specific tension of a man who is managing something enormous and has not yet decided what form to let it take. Roy's been on this ranch 11 years, he said. I know, Emma said. He has no reason. He stopped. He has a reason, Emma said quietly. He just chose the wrong one. William turned around. His face had settled into something that she recognized now. The face he wore when he had made a decision and was on the other side of the making of it. Something had resolved in him, and the resolution had not been easy, and she could see the cost of it. I need to get to town, he said. I need to find out what Driscoll actually filed and when. Take me with you, Emma said. He blinked. Why? Because 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, she said. And because you're angry and I'm not, and the county clerk's office is going to respond better to someone who isn't angry. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Be ready in an hour. She was ready in 20 minutes. The ride into Millhaven was the first time Emma had been anywhere in William Carter's company outside the ranch, and it was different in a way she hadn't anticipated. The particular difference of being seen with someone in public, of occupying the same space in front of other people, with all the stories that implied. She was aware of the looks they got when William's wagon came down Millhaven's main street, with her sitting beside him, and she kept her chin level and her back straight, and did not acknowledge the looks directly, because she had spent enough of her life acknowledging looks that she had developed a sophisticated taxonomy of which ones deserved response and which ones deserved the dignity of being ignored. The county clerk was a small, precise man named Hensley, who looked at William with the wary respect of someone who had always found him slightly intimidating, and at Emma with the mild surprise of someone trying to calculate who she was and what her presence signified. William asked to see any filed claims or encumbrances on the water rights for the Carter property parcels in the northern section of Millhaven County, and Hensley went to look, and they waited. Emma looked around the clerk's office while they waited. It was not a large room, and it was stuffed with the paper accumulation of decades of territorial administration, and she read the labels on the ledger spines and thought about what she was looking for, what the shape of the problem was, where the weakness in it might be. Hensley came back with 2 documents. William reached for them. Emma put her hand on his arm, lightly, just for a moment. He looked at her. She looked at Hensley. May I? She asked. Hensley looked at William. William, after a brief pause, nodded. Emma took the documents. She read them slowly and carefully, the way her mother had always read anything important, not for the sense of it first, but for the structure, the dates, the names, the specific weight of the legal language, and where it was precise and where it was vague. She found it on the second page of the second document. "Mr. Hensley," she said, "this seal here." She turned the document and pointed to the judge's seal. "Can you tell me which judge issued this?" Hensley looked. He frowned. He took the document from her and looked at it more closely, and then he went back to his shelves and pulled down a different ledger and compared something in it to the document. And then he looked up. "This seal number," he said slowly, "is registered to Judge Alton Firse." He paused. Judge Firse retired in 1876. He looked at the date on the document. "This claim is dated 1879. The silence in the clerk's office was absolute. "A retired judge," Emma said quietly, "cannot issue a valid land encumbrance filing." Hensley set the ledger down with extreme deliberateness. "No," he said, "he cannot." William took the document from Hensley and looked at the seal. His jaw was very tight. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was past anger and into something colder and more controlled. "This is fraudulent," he said. "It appears so," Hensley said, with the particular caution of a man who is aware he has just found himself in the middle of something significant. "I would need to verify further, Mr. Carter, but—" He looked at Emma and then back at William. "I would suggest you retain a lawyer before you proceed." "I'll do that," William said. He put his hat on and turned for the door, and then he stopped and looked back at Emma, who was carefully noting down the judge's name, the seal registration number, and the date discrepancy in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying. "Emma," he said. She looked up. His face was doing something complicated. Gratitude and something else underneath it. Something that she didn't look at directly because it was too new and too large for the middle of a county clerk's office. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." She followed him out. On the wagon back to the ranch, they didn't speak for a long time. The road unrolled before them, and the afternoon light came at a lower angle now, and the mountains in the distance had taken on the particular deep blue they went at that time of day, and Emma sat beside William Carter and felt the enormity of what had just shifted between them settle quietly into place. He said finally, "How did you know to check the seal?" "My mother's lawyer checked ours," Emma said. He said fraudulent documents almost always have something wrong with the official marks. People forge the content. They have more trouble forging the procedural details correctly. He was quiet. "She taught you how to survive being cheated," he said. "She taught me how to survive," Emma said. Being cheated was a subset, as high might a sound that might, in another man, have been a laugh. In William Carter, it was just a brief exhalation with a particular quality to it, and Emma decided it counted. The ranch came into view at the end of the road, and they could see from a distance that something was happening. Men gathered near the main house. William sat up straighter, and she felt the change in him immediately. The snap back into the particular alertness of a man responsible for a lot of people who has just seen something he wasn't expecting. He pushed the horses faster. Roy Briggs was standing in the middle of the yard when they pulled in, and he was not alone. Beside him was a man Emma had never seen before, well-dressed for a county road, with a suit that had been expensive once, and hair that had been arranged with visible care. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to doing business in places where the business was not entirely clean, and he wore it with the particular confidence of someone who had never yet been caught in the right way at the right time. Harlan Driscoll. She knew it before William said the name. The men who had gathered were standing at the edges of the yard with the uncertain posture of people who had been told something alarming and were waiting to understand how alarming it was. Jesse was near the barn door, his face tight with something she recognized as controlled worry. Doc stood a little apart with his arms crossed and his weathered face closed and watchful. William climbed down from the wagon. Emma climbed down beside him. Driscoll looked at her with a brief assessment that was thorough and dismissive simultaneously. The look of a man who categorized people quickly by their usefulness to him and had already determined she had none. "Mr. Carter," Driscoll said. His voice was smooth and carried the easy authority of someone who spent a great deal of time being confident in front of other people. "I hope you've had time to review my documents." "I have," William said. "I've also had them reviewed at the county clerk's office." Something moved across Driscoll's face. Just a flicker. "Then you understand the legitimacy of the claim," Driscoll said. "I understand that the claim carries a seal from a judge who retired 3 years before the document was dated," William said, "which the county clerk's registration confirmed this afternoon." The yard was very quiet. Driscoll looked at Roy Briggs, and the look was fast and involuntary, and told Emma everything she needed to know about what Roy's role in this had actually been. Roy's jaw tightened. He looked at the ground. "Mr. Carter," Driscoll said, recovering quickly, the voice going smoother. "I'm sure there's an explanation for the administrative discrepancy. These things happen with old documents." "A retired judge cannot issue a valid encumbrance," Emma said. Driscoll looked at her directly for the first time. His expression was the specific expression of a man who has been interrupted by someone he had already decided was not worth his attention and is recalculating. "And you are?" he said. "Someone who was at the county clerk's office," Emma said, "when the seal registration numbers were compared. The number on your document does not match any active judicial record from 1879. She looked at him steadily. "Would you like me to read you the notes I took?" She held up her notebook. The silence in the yard stretched long enough that it started to take on its own weight. Driscoll looked at William. "Your cook keeps notes," he said. He said it the way men say things when they want to diminish something by naming it incorrectly. "My cook," William said, and his voice had gone to the specific register it went to when he was past patience. "Walked 4 miles on her own to make sure my ranch stayed supplied when someone was stealing from the larder. She rode to town with me today and found the flaw in your documents in 5 minutes. So I'd suggest you stop thinking about what she is and start thinking about what she just told you." Driscoll looked between them. The yard full of men looked at Driscoll, and something shifted in the weight of the whole situation, the specific shift of a bluff that has been called in front of enough witnesses that it can't be recalibrated. "I'll need to review the registration records myself," Driscoll said finally, and his voice had lost its smoothness. It was the voice of a man buying time. "You do that," William said. "And while you're reviewing them, I'll be retaining a lawyer who will be reviewing them too." Driscoll picked up his hat from where it rested on the fence post beside him. He looked at Roy Briggs, and the look he gave was not a warm one. Roy Briggs, for the first time since Emma had arrived at Carter Ranch, had the look of a man who is finally fully understanding the situation he put himself in. Driscoll walked to his horse and mounted without another word, and rode out through the gate, and the sound of hooves on the road faded, and the yard watched him go. Then every man in that yard turned and looked at Emma Dawson. She had gotten used to being looked at. But she had not been looked at like this before. Not with this particular quality of attention. The attention of people who have just witnessed something unexpected and are recalibrating their understanding of who they're looking at. Jesse was the first one to move. He crossed the yard and stopped in front of Emma, and he said simply, "You found it. The thing wrong with the documents. That was you." "It was the seal registration," Emma said. "That was you," Jesse said again, as if she hadn't spoken. Doc cleared his throat. He stepped forward and he took off his hat. The same gesture he'd made at the kitchen window. The same acknowledgement that went beyond words. Several of the other men followed without prompting, hats coming off, the particular gesture of the frontier that meant something real. Emma looked at all of them and felt something catch in her throat that she swallowed down, because this was not the moment for it. Roy Briggs had not moved from where he stood in the middle of the yard. He was looking at the gate where Driscoll had ridden out, and his face had the look of a man trying to decide which version of the next moment he was going to choose. William walked toward him. The men who were standing between them found reasons to step aside. William stopped in front of Roy, and they looked at each other with the full weight of 11 years between them, and the weight of what had happened on top of it, and the weight of what Roy had chosen when he'd chosen it. "I don't know," William said quietly. "What he offered you. I don't know what you were thinking." Roy said nothing. 11 years, William said. "You've been on this ranch 11 years. Roy looked at him. Something moved across Roy's face that wasn't quite remorse and wasn't quite defiance, but was somewhere between them. The specific conflict of a man who has done something he can't entirely justify, and isn't yet sure whether he's sorry for the doing of it, or only for the failing of it. "I thought you were making a mistake," Roy said. Finally. His voice was rough. "With her. With bringing her here. I thought—" "You thought wrong," William said. "And you didn't tell me. You went around me." Roy looked at Emma then, and it was the longest direct look he had ever given her, and she looked back without flinching, because she was not going to flinch now, not after everything. "You could have just talked to me," Emma said. "From the beginning. If you had a concern, you could have said it to my face." Roy looked at her. He looked at the gate. He looked at the dirt. "I know," he said. It came out quieter than she expected. "I know that now." William took a breath. "Pack your gear tonight," he said. "You can go in the morning. I'll give you 2 weeks' wages." Roy nodded once. He put his hat back on and walked toward the bunkhouse, and the men who were still in the yard gave him room and didn't speak, because there are moments where silence is the only dignified response. The yard was very still for a moment after Roy disappeared inside the bunkhouse door. Then Jesse said, to no one in particular, "Well." And someone else said, "Yeah." And Doc put his hat back on, and someone began walking back toward the barn, and someone else followed, and the ranch gradually resumed the particular rhythms of a place that has just experienced something significant and is returning, carefully, to its ordinary motion. William turned back to Emma. They were nearly alone in the yard now, just the two of them, and the late afternoon light and the enormous Montana sky. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "I've been better," he said. "I've also been considerably worse." She nodded. "That's about how I feel." He looked at her for a long moment, and the look had something in it she recognized from the kitchen. The look of a man getting further than he'd planned, and finding it wasn't as frightening as he'd thought. "Emma," he said. "Yes," she said. "I don't—" He stopped, turned his hat in his hands. "I don't know how to say what I want to say." "Then don't say it yet," she said. "There's time." He looked at her with something that she could only call relief. "All right," he said, and then, "There's supper to think about," he said, returning to the practical the way he always did. The way she had come to understand was not avoidance, but anchoring. The way he kept himself connected to the ground beneath him. "There is," Emma said. "I was thinking beans and cornbread. It's been a long day." "Beans and cornbread sounds right," he said. They walked back to the house, side by side, not speaking, through the late afternoon light of a Montana summer that had gone long and slow and was finally beginning to cool, and Emma was aware of the distance between them. Not large, 2 people walking the same direction. And the way that distance had changed in the weeks since she'd arrived, without either of them naming the changing. The way the most important changes never quite announced themselves. In the kitchen, she started the beans. William went to his study to begin going through his own documents, because there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And the legal matter of Harlan Driscoll was not finished just because Driscoll had ridden away. But the worst of the danger had been named in front of witnesses, and a name given to a danger in front of witnesses was a danger already partially beaten. Jesse appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was working. He leaned in the frame the way he always did, comfortable in the not quite in not quite out position he had claimed for himself over the past month. "Miss Emma," he said. She looked up. "I've been on 4 ranches," he said, "before this one. And I've never—" He stopped. "The way you did that today, in the yard, and at the clerk's office, what Carter said you did." "Jesse," she said, "eat something. You look pale." "I'm trying to say something," he said. "Say it faster," she said. "I've got beans to watch." He grinned despite himself. "You're the best thing that happened to this ranch," he said, "is what I'm trying to say. And I think most of the men out there would tell you the same if they knew how." Emma looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it had cost her to get here. The restaurant, her mother, the years of being told she was the wrong size and the wrong kind and the wrong everything. She thought about the letters she'd read by lamplight in a rented room in Billings, and the stagecoach north, and standing at the ranch gate with her suitcase and her recipe book, while men looked at her and drew their conclusions. "Thank you, Jesse," she said. He nodded, satisfied. "What do you need me to do?" "Cornbread," she said. "Start the skillet." He moved into the kitchen without another word and found the skillet and started it on the second burner. And they worked side by side in the warm kitchen while the beans went and the evening came on and the ranch outside settled into its nighttime sounds. She thought about Roy Briggs and the choice he'd made and the smaller choice he'd made at the end. The quiet I know that had come out rougher than he probably intended. She did not feel triumphant about Roy. She felt something more complicated. The specific complexity of winning something at a cost she hadn't fully calculated yet, because Roy had been 11 years on this ranch, and his leaving was going to change things in ways she couldn't predict. She thought about Harlan Driscoll, riding back to Millhaven with his forged documents and his consortium money and his smooth voice. And she thought about what a man like that did when he didn't get what he wanted on the first attempt. She had learned enough, in the past weeks, about the way trouble worked to know that Driscoll was not finished. He had only retreated. He would recalculate, the same way Roy had recalculated after the confrontation in the yard, and then he would try again from a different angle. She needed to think about what that angle might be. She put a piece of cornbread on a plate and set it on a tray with a bowl of beans and a cup of coffee. The way William took it, black, no ceremony, and she carried it down the hall to the study and knocked on the closed door. "Come in," he said. She opened the door and set the tray on the corner of the desk that wasn't covered in documents, and she looked at the spread of papers and saw that he had been working through them methodically, with notes in his own hand in the margins of a separate page. "You should eat," she said. He looked at the tray, then he looked at her. "There's something else in these documents," he said. She waited. "There's a second encumbrance," he said. "Different from Driscoll's. Filed legitimately by a real judge in 1883. He looked at the document in his hand. "It's a lien against the east pasture. I didn't know it was there when I bought the property. Alderman didn't disclose it." He set the paper down. "If it's valid, and I believe it is, then someone has a legitimate claim against the east pasture. A small one, but enough that if Driscoll knows about it and decides to buy the lien and uses it as a legal foothold, he gets a piece of the ranch legitimately," Emma said. "Yes," William said. She came fully into the study and stood at the desk and looked at the document he'd been reading. And she thought about what she'd learned in the clerk's office and what she'd learned at dinner tables over a month of listening. And she thought about the shape of what Harlan Driscoll was actually doing. Not a single attack, but a strategy, testing weaknesses, probing from multiple directions. "Who holds the lien currently?" she asked. "A man in Helena," William said. "I don't know him." "Find out," Emma said, "before Driscoll does." William looked at her with the look she was beginning to understand was not surprise anymore, but something that had replaced surprise, a kind of settled reliance, an expectation of her that had arrived without his having planned for it, and that she could see both pleased and unsettled him in equal measure. "In the morning," he said. "I'll ride to Helena." "Good," she said. She turned to leave. "Emma," he said. She turned back. He was looking at her with all of that complicated expression on his face, and he said, "You take care of everyone except yourself. I've been watching you do it for a month." She looked at him. "Someone has to," she said. He shook his head, slowly. "That's not—" He stopped. "You walked 4 miles to protect this ranch's supplies. You sat in a county clerk's office and read a fraudulent document until you found what was wrong with it. You stood in the yard and faced a man who could have made your life here very difficult." He set down the paper he was holding. "What do you get out of it, Emma? What are you getting for yourself in all of this?" She was quiet for a long moment. "The same thing everyone gets," she said finally. "When they're somewhere they actually want to be." He looked at her. Outside the study window, the Montana night was settling in full, dark and clear and enormous, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made its sound. and the ranch around them was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that has had a long, hard, important day and is finally letting itself rest. "Get some sleep," Emma said. "You're riding to Helena in the morning." She walked out and closed the study door behind her. In the hallway, she stood alone for a moment with her hand still on the doorframe, and she breathed, and she allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. All of it. The clerk's office, and Driscoll in the yard, and Roy Briggs's quiet broken acknowledgement, and the second document, and everything that was still coming, that she could feel gathering at the edges of what she knew. She was not afraid. She was tired, and she was not afraid. And that, she thought, was the truest thing she could say about herself right now. She went back to the kitchen and banked the fire and cleaned the last of the dishes, and she wrote in her notebook by the low lamplight, "Day 31. The documents were wrong. We found it. He's riding to Helena tomorrow. I don't know what comes next." She paused. Then she wrote, "But I'm not leaving." She closed the notebook and turned out the lamp and walked through the dark house to her room, and outside the Montana sky was enormous and full of stars. And somewhere to the south, Harlan Driscoll was riding through the dark toward Millhaven, already thinking about his next move. And Emma Dawson was already thinking about hers. William left for Helena before sunrise. Emma heard him in the hallway before first light. The careful step of a man trying not to wake the house. The specific quiet of someone who had been awake long enough that the night had stopped mattering. And she was already up, already in the kitchen, because she had not slept well either, and had given up on pretending around 3 in the morning. She had coffee ready when he appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hat and his coat and the leather satchel he used for documents. He stopped when he saw her. She could tell he hadn't expected it. "You didn't have to," he started. "Sit down," she said. "5 minutes. Drink your coffee." He sat. She put the coffee in front of him and a plate of bread and cold meat from last night, and he ate without arguing, which she had learned to read as a form of trust. William Carter. Arguing about a meal was William Carter feeling like he needed to maintain distance. William Carter eating without argument was William Carter having decided the distance was unnecessary. "You know what you're looking for in Helena?" she asked. "The lion holder," he said. "I want to know who he is and what it would cost to buy the lien outright before Driscoll can get to it." "And if the price is too high?" "Then I find another way," he said. "But I'd rather solve it clean." She nodded. She had been thinking about it since she'd closed the study door the night before, and she had been thinking about something else too. Something she had not yet said to him, because it required knowing whether he was the kind of man who could hear it without letting it change how he looked at her. She had decided, sometime around 4 in the morning, that he was. "There's something else you should look for while you're there," she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Driscoll," she said. "Find out who he actually represents. Not the consortium name, the actual people behind it. Because a man like Driscoll doesn't come to a county like this with forged documents and 11 months of groundwork for a water rights claim worth a few hundred acres. There's something larger." She paused. "Someone told me at dinner, about 3 weeks ago, Pete, I think, that there had been surveyors up in the northern pass last spring, not county surveyors, private ones." William set down his cup. "Private surveyors," he said slowly. "For a railroad route," Emma said. "That's what the men were guessing. Nobody thought much of it at the time." She looked at him steadily. "But if there's a rail line coming through the northern pass, and Driscoll's consortium owns the water rights to the land along that route, and then acquires the east pasture lien." "They don't need the ranch," William said. He said it quietly, like something settling into place. "They need the corridor." "The ranch is in the middle of the corridor," Emma said. He was very still. "If they can't get the land outright," she said, "they can make it impossible to operate. Deny water access on the north. Hold the lien on the east. Squeeze from both sides until I sell," William said, "for whatever they're willing to offer." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's what happened to the Kendrick place," Emma said. "And probably at least one other property before it. This isn't about your ranch specifically, William. You're one piece of a larger thing." William Carter stood up. He picked up his hat and his satchel, and he stood at the kitchen table and looked at Emma Dawson with an expression that had moved past the complicated thing. It had been the night before into something cleaner and more direct, the expression of a man who has stopped managing the distance between himself and something true. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he asked. "Since the clerk's office," she said. "Longer, if I'm honest. But I didn't have all the pieces until last night." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me sooner." "I know," she said. "But I needed to be certain. I didn't want to give you a theory. I wanted to give you something you could use." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who understood the distinction and respected it, and it was the closest she'd seen him come to saying something with his body that he wasn't ready to say with words. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said. "Day after at the latest." "I'll keep things running," she said. He put his hat on. He walked to the kitchen door and opened it, and the early morning dark was just beginning to go gray at the edges, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and she waited. "Emma," he said without turning. "Yes," she said. "When this is settled," he said, "when all of this is behind us, I want to—" He stopped. The back of his neck was doing the thing it did when he was working very hard against himself. "There are things I want to say to you, when I can say them right." She let the silence hold for a moment. "I'll be here," she said. He walked out. She stood at the kitchen window and listened to his horse moving away down the road, and then she turned back to the stove and started the day. The ranch ran differently with William gone. It wasn't chaos. These were experienced men, and Jesse had more capability than his 19 years suggested, and Doc had been managing things in quiet ways for longer than anyone formally acknowledged. But there was a particular tension that settled over the place when its owner was absent, and the reason for the absence was known. And Emma felt it in the dining room at breakfast, in the way the men ate faster and talked less, and in the way 2 or 3 of them lingered after the meal was technically over, as if proximity to the kitchen was a form of steadiness. Doc was the last to leave. He stood near the door and looked at Emma with his hat in his hands and said, "You holding up all right, Miss Emma?" "Fine," she said. "Go do what needs doing." "The men are—" He paused. "They're worried." "Tell them William will be back by nightfall," she said. "Tell them the work is the work regardless." She looked at him. "And tell Jesse to check the north fence line today. I want to know if anything's been disturbed up there." Doc blinked. "The north fence? If Driscoll's people were up in the pass doing surveys," Emma said, "they came from somewhere. And surveyors make notes about access and obstacles. If there are markers on this property that shouldn't be there, I want to know before William gets back." Doc looked at her for a long moment, with the specific look he sometimes got, the look that was old and assessing and not unkind. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he put his hat on and went. She spent the morning in the kitchen and the afternoon at the work table with her notebook, going back through everything she'd heard and recorded since arriving at Carter Ranch. The overheard conversations, the small details, the names mentioned in passing, the pieces that had seemed unconnected and were now beginning to suggest a shape. She was not a lawyer. She was not a detective. She was a woman who had learned, in 31 years of living as someone other people consistently underestimated, that paying close attention to everything was the most powerful form of preparation available to her. Jesse came back from the north fence at 4 o'clock. He came straight to the kitchen, which told her before he spoke that he'd found something. "3 steaks," he said, before he was fully through the door. "Iron stakes, driven into the ground about 50 yards inside the property line on the northern section. Survey markers. And they're not county issue. I know what county markers look like, and these aren't them." Emma wrote it down. "Did you pull them?" she asked. "No," Jesse said. "Wasn't sure if I should." "Good," she said. "Leave them exactly where they are. We need William and a lawyer to see them in place." She looked up. "Anyone with you?" "Hector," Jesse said. "He saw them too." "Good," Emma said again. "2 witnesses." Jesse leaned on the doorframe, and the familiar position had a different quality today. Less casual, more like a young man who has realized something about himself in the past few hours. "Miss Emma," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can try," she said. "Did you know when you came here that it was going to be like this?" She looked at him. "Like what?" All of it, he said. He gestured vaguely, meaning everything. The Roy Briggs situation, Driscoll, the documents, the whole complicated weight of the past month. Did you know it was going to be more than just cooking? Emma thought about the letter she'd read by lamplight in Billings. The sparse words, room and wages provided. No, she said. I knew I needed work. I knew I could cook. That's all I knew. He nodded slowly. And now? She thought about that for a moment. Now I know this is where I'm supposed to be, she said. That's all anyone ever really knows. Not what's coming, just where they are. Jesse thought about that with the seriousness of a 19-year-old encountering an idea that matters. Then he nodded again, satisfied, and said, Is there anything left from dinner? I didn't eat enough at noon. She fed him, and the moment passed back into the ordinary. William came home at dusk. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she heard something in the pace of it. Not the careful, controlled pace of the morning's departure, but something faster, more urgent. And she stepped onto the porch as he rode through the gate and came across the yard. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, which she had never seen him do, and he handed the reins to the hand who came forward without looking at the man, and he came straight to her. I found the lien holder, he said. And? She said. He sold it, William said. 6 days ago. Her stomach dropped. To whom? She said, though she already knew. A property holding company out of Helena called Meridian Land Associates, William said. I'd never heard of it. Neither had the clerk I spoke to. He looked at her. But the lawyer I found has. He says Meridian is a shell company. He's seen it before, used by investors who don't want their names on public documents. Driscoll's consortium, Emma said. Almost certainly, William said. He's already got the lien. He bought it 6 days ago. That was 3 days before he came here with the forged water rights documents. His jaw was set. The forged documents were never the main move, Emma. They were a test. He wanted to see how I'd react, what I knew, whether I had anyone around me who could identify the problem. If I'd have taken the bait, if I'd have spent my energy fighting the fake claim, he'd have had time to consolidate the real one. The yard had gone quiet around them. Several men had drifted closer without appearing to. The specific drift of people who understand something important is being said and want to be nearby without intruding. The surveyor's stakes, Emma said. Jesse found them today. 3 of them on the northern section. Something moved across William's face. He took a breath through his nose, slow and deliberate, and then let it out. He's already mapped the route, he said. Yes, Emma said. But he doesn't have the land. He has the lien on the east pasture, William said. He can use it to apply for forced sale proceedings if I can't make good on the original debt it secures. And the original debt? He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite helplessness. William Carter didn't have helplessness in him, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has done everything right and is looking at something that isn't fair. The original debt is $700, Emma, from before I bought the property. Alderman's debt that I didn't know I was inheriting. And I don't, right now, with the herd numbers what they are after last winter. I don't have $700 liquid. The silence that followed was long. Jesse, from the edge of the porch, said quietly, I've got 47 saved. Doc said, 63. Hector said something in Spanish and then said, I don't know the English for all of it, but it's about 80. Emma looked at them, the men standing at the edges of the yard in the dusk, hats in hands or thumbs in belts, the specific posture of people who have decided something. William looked at them too. His face did something complicated, and then it did something else, and she could see him working against whatever was happening behind it. I can't take your wages, he said. You're not taking anything, Doc said. We're offering. It ain't right, William said. It ain't right what that Driscoll fella did either, Jesse said, with the particular directness of the very young. But here we are. Emma said nothing. She let the men say what they were saying. Let William feel the weight of it, because this was a moment that didn't need her intervention. It needed her witness. William looked at the ground for a moment. When he looked up, his jaw was tight and his eyes were bright with something he was managing with visible effort. "I will pay every one of you back," he said. "Every dollar." "We know that," Doc said simply. What happened next happened fast, in a way Emma had learned to recognize as the shape that real trouble takes. Not the slow-building kind, but the kind that arrives all at once all the pieces are in position. She was in the kitchen the following morning when she heard a horse coming fast up the road. Not William's horse. She knew William's horse. But coming hard, the particular fast coming of someone with news that can't wait. It was Hector. He had been in Millhaven the night before and had stayed at the boarding house because it was late. He came through the gate and was off his horse and at the kitchen door in under a minute. "Driscoll filed," he said. "Last night. I was at the saloon when his man came in talking about it. He filed for forced sale proceedings on the East Pasture lien, citing the debt. The hearing is in 11 days. Emma set down what was in her hands. 11 days. William appeared behind her, because he had heard the horse too, and Hector said it again, and William was very still for a moment. 11 days is not enough time to contest it properly, William said. No, Emma said, but it might be enough time to make it irrelevant. She looked at him. The forged water rights documents. Hensley has them in the county record. If Driscoll filed a fraudulent document with a county office, that's not a civil matter. That's criminal fraud. William looked at her. If he's facing a criminal fraud investigation, Emma said, any civil proceedings he initiates are going to come under scrutiny. A judge hearing a forced sale petition from a man already under investigation for forging court documents is going to be very careful about how quickly he moves. That buys time, William said. That buys time, Emma confirmed. And time is what you need. William was already reaching for his coat. I need you to do something, Emma said. He stopped. Go see the sheriff, she said. Not the county clerk this time, the sheriff. With the document, and Hensley's comparison of the seal registration. File the complaint formally, today, before Driscoll's people have time to manage the narrative. Will you? He stopped, started again. Will you come? She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. They rode to Millhaven together again, and this time, Emma was aware of a different quality in being seen beside him. Something had shifted since the last time, and the shift was visible in the way William Carter carried himself, not the contained, self-sufficient posture of the man she'd met at the ranch gate 2 months ago, but something slightly more open, the posture of a man who has allowed himself to be accompanied. The sheriff's name was Aldridge, and he was a large, deliberate man who listened to everything twice before responding to it. He listened to William. He looked at the document and the notes Emma had made at the clerk's office. He sent a deputy to get Hensley, who came and confirmed the seal registration discrepancy in person. And then Sheriff Aldridge sat back in his chair and said, Mr. Carter, this is the third complaint I've had about Harlan Driscoll in the past 2 weeks. William and Emma both went still. Third, William said. The Morrison family north of here, Aldridge said. And a widow named Pierce, who had a property east of Millhaven. Both reported pressure. Both found problems with documents Driscoll presented to them. He looked at the papers on his desk. I haven't had enough to move on until now. A forged judicial seal on a filed county document. That's enough. He stood up. I'm going to send a wire to the Territorial Marshal's office today, and I'm going to request that any civil proceedings filed by or on behalf of Harlan Driscoll or Meridian Land Associates be suspended pending investigation. Emma let out a breath she had been holding since Hector had ridden through the gate that morning. How long will the suspension take? William asked. I can have it before the circuit judge by tomorrow morning, Aldridge said. He's in town this week. Good timing. He looked between them. Where'd you find the seal discrepancy? She found it, William said. He said it with a flatness that was not modest. It was simply precise, the statement of someone placing credit where it belonged. She read the document and asked about the judge's registration number. Aldridge looked at Emma. His expression was the specific expression of a man reassessing something in real time. Ma'am, he said. Sheriff, Emma said. He nodded once, with the particular respect of a man who gives it rarely and means it when he does. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and William was quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. Not the contained private silence she'd first known him by, but the quiet of someone who has set down something heavy and hasn't yet figured out how to move without the weight of it. She let him be quiet. She was quiet too. About a mile from the ranch, he said, 3 families. At least, Emma said. How was working through the county, William said, systematically, taking the ones who couldn't fight back first, building toward the larger properties. Yes, Emma said. If you hadn't come, he said slowly, if you hadn't been listening at the dinner table, hadn't known about the seal registrations, hadn't thought to ask Hensley the right questions. He stopped. I would have been fighting the fake claim while he consolidated the real one. By the time I understood what was actually happening, it would have been too late. She didn't say anything. Emma, he said. She looked at him. Howe was looking at the road ahead, and the late light was on his face, and she could see all the complicated things it had been doing for 2 months, finally settling into something simpler and more honest. The face of a man who has stopped fighting the direction he's moving and is just moving. I built walls, he said. After Sarah died, I told myself it was practical. I told myself a man in my position couldn't afford. He stopped, turned the reins in his hands. I convinced myself that being alone was the same as being strong. She waited. You didn't argue with that, he said. You didn't tell me I was wrong. You just stayed and cooked and listened to every conversation in the dining room and kept receipts and found what was wrong with the document. He paused. And somehow, in the middle of all of that, you made me remember what it felt like to have someone in the house. Emma felt the words land in her chest, the way the first good meal of a long hunger lands. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the deep, quiet completeness of something returning to where it's supposed to be. I wasn't trying to make you remember anything, she said. I was just being where I was. I know, he said. That's why it worked. The ranch gate appeared at the end of the road, and the men came out at the sound of the horse, and Jesse was the first to read William's face when he rode in, and Emma saw the relief move through Jesse's shoulders before he said a word. Sheriff's filing with the circuit judge, Emma said, climbing down. Tomorrow morning. Driscoll's proceedings should be suspended. Jesse's face broke into the first full, unguarded grin she'd seen from him in 3 days. Behind him, Hector said something that needed no translation. Doc took his hat off and looked at the sky for a moment, which was his way. That night at dinner, something different happened. Emma had made a full meal, the best she could manage given the day they'd all had. And when she came out of the kitchen and looked at the dining room, she stopped. The men were waiting. Not the way they usually waited, each doing his own thing until the food came out. They were sitting and waiting, and when she appeared in the doorway, they stood up. All of them. She had been at Carter Ranch for 61 days. She had fed these men 3 times a day for 61 days. She had walked 8 miles round trip to keep them supplied when someone was taking from the larder. She had ridden to the county clerk's office and found a fraudulent seal. She had stayed up going through notes by lamplight. She had cooked through grief and been alone in a kitchen that hadn't asked for her and made it hers anyway. And 30 men stood up when she walked into the room. She stood in the doorway and she looked at them and she felt it. The thing she'd been carrying alongside the grief and the determination and the practical stubbornness of survival. The specific want of belonging somewhere, of being somewhere that knew you were there. Sit down, she said, before it gets cold. They sat. They laughed. She went back to the kitchen because she needed a moment alone, and she stood at the basin with her hands braced on the edge, and she breathed. And she allowed herself more than 30 seconds this time. She allowed herself as long as it took, and when it was done, she straightened up and wiped her face and went back to the dining room and sat down herself, which she almost never did. But William had put a plate at the table for her and looked at her when she came back with the particular look that said he had understood what the moment in the doorway had cost her and was not going to remark on it. She sat beside him, and she ate with the men of Carter Ranch for the first time. And the conversation was ordinary and loud, and full of the specific kind of laughter that happens between people who have been through something together and are on the other side of it. And it was the best dinner she'd been at since her mother's restaurant. Later, when the dining room had cleared and the kitchen was clean and the ranch had gone quiet for the night, Emma sat at the work table with her notebook and her mother's recipe book and listened to the house settling around her. William came in. He had his hat off, which he usually kept on inside. Another small change, she had noticed them all. And he sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up. "When you came here," he said. "When you first got off the stage in Millhaven and hired that boy with the cart to bring you out here, what were you expecting?" She thought about it. "Work," she said. "Wages. A roof." "That's all?" "That was enough," she said. "At the time." He looked at his hands on the table. Large hands, scarred and roughened from decades of physical work, resting on the surface of the work table she had spent 2 months turning into something that felt like hers. "And now?" he said. She considered him for a long moment. The face she'd first seen at the ranch gate, assessing, contained, already half decided against her, had become this face, the one that sat across from her now, the one that had learned, over 61 days, to show her what it was actually doing. "Now I'm not sure how to answer that without saying something you might not be ready to hear," she said honestly. He looked up. "Say it," he said. Quiet and direct, the way he was when he'd made up his mind. "Whatever it is, say it." She looked at him for a moment. "This feels like mine," she said. "The kitchen, the ranch, the men." She paused. "You." The word sat on the table between them, very still. William Carter looked at her for a long, long moment, and she could see everything that had happened in 61 days crossing his face in the order it had happened. The dismissal that first afternoon, the whispered, "Who are you?" across the dining room, the wildflowers on the work table, the clerk's office, the yard with Driscoll, the ride home in the late light, all of it moving through him like something being counted. "I owe you the truth," he said finally. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I do," he said. "Because I almost sent you away. That first day. I looked at you standing at my gate, and I almost told you the position was filled." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "And I have thought about that, Emma. I have thought about what this place would be right now if I had done that. What I would be." He stopped. "Emptier than I knew how to feel." She held very still. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying what I mean when what I mean is—" He stopped again. Tried again. "When Sarah died, I decided I was done with the part of life that involved letting someone matter to me. I thought it was a reasonable decision. I thought I was being practical." He looked at her directly. "You walked into my kitchen, and you made 30 men feel like they were home, and somewhere in the middle of watching you do that, I stopped being able to pretend that I didn't want the same thing." The house was very quiet around them. "William," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "Because I have started this about 14 times in my head, and if I stop I don't know if I'll get back to it." He took a breath. "I would like you to stay. Not as the cook. Not as—" He stopped and something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of something like a smile, the first real one she'd seen from him. The cooking is extraordinary, and I would be a fool to lose it, but that is not—" He took another breath. "I am asking you to stay because I want you here, because this house is better with you in it, because you are the most capable and honest and—" He stopped. "And I am apparently not as good at this as I thought I was going to be." Emma looked at him. She thought about the road that had brought her here, the restaurant, her mother, the rented room in Billings, the stage north, the ranch gate, the kitchen that had felt like someone's giving up. She thought about the 30 seconds her mother had always allowed for satisfaction, and the longer time she'd allowed herself in the doorway of the dining room tonight. And she thought that her mother would have opinions about William Carter, specific and direct opinions, and she thought that the main opinion would be he stayed at the table. "You're doing fine," Emma said. He looked at her. "With the saying of it," she said. "You're doing fine." He let out a breath that she recognized as relief, and then he reached across the work table, slowly, the way a man does something he's been building toward for a long time and is finally letting himself arrive at, and he put his hand on the table near hers. Not on hers, not yet, but near enough that the intention was clear and the choice was hers. She put her hand over his. He looked down at it. Then he looked up at her. And the face that had been so carefully managed for so long, the face of a man who had spent years making sure nothing showed, was just open, undefended, the face of someone present. 61 days, he said quietly. 61 days, she agreed. Outside the window, the Montana night was enormous and permanent, and somewhere in Millhaven, the circuit judge was reading Sheriff Aldridge's filing and considering his suspension order. Somewhere further away, Harlan Driscoll was calculating his next move with information that was already incomplete and getting more incomplete by the hour. The ranch was quiet, and the men were sleeping, and the stove was banked, and Emma Dawson's mother's recipe book sat on the work table with 61 days of notes in the back of it. She did not know yet that in the morning there would be more to do. There was always more to do. Or that the circuit judge would sign the suspension order before noon. Or that Sheriff Aldridge would ride out to Carter Ranch in the afternoon, with news that the territorial marshal had opened a formal investigation, and that Harlan Driscoll had been advised by his own lawyer to leave Montana Territory pending the outcome. She did not know yet that Roy Briggs would appear at the ranch gate 3 days later with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that cost him something to wear, asking to speak to William, and then, after that, asking to speak to Emma, saying only, "I was wrong about you. I knew it before the yard, and I should have said it then." She did not know any of that yet. What she knew, in that kitchen, at that work table, with William Carter's hand under hers, and the Montana night outside, and the recipe book open to the pages where she'd been writing her own additions since she was 6 years old. What she knew was that she had arrived with a suitcase and her mother's recipes, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told too many times that she was not enough. And she had stayed. And in staying, she had built something, not alone. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully understood at the beginning. Not alone, and not without cost, and not without the particular difficulty of being in a place that hadn't been made for her and making it hers anyway, one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one honest moment at a time. She had built something, and the man sitting across from her, with his careful hands and his hard-earned face, and the 61 days of slow, reluctant opening that had brought him to this table, this moment. He was part of what she'd built. He was maybe the most important part. She closed her mother's recipe book. She left her hand where it was. "It's late," she said. "It is," he said. Neither of them moved. "Tomorrow's going to be a full day," she said. "It will," he said. A pause. Outside, a coyote called, far away, and the Montana night answered it with silence, and the house around them held the warmth of 61 days of living in it. "William," she said. "Emma," he said. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that have already been had, in kitchens, and in yards, and in county clerk's offices, and on wagon rides through the late afternoon light, and what remains at the end of them is not more words but just the fact of two people, at a table, choosing to be exactly where they are. Roy Briggs came back on a Thursday. Emma saw him from this kitchen window, the particular set of his shoulders that she had learned to read over the weeks he'd been on the ranch. But different now. The shoulders of a man who has spent time alone with a decision and arrived at the hardest version of it. He tied his horse at the gate and stood there for a moment before walking toward the house, hat already in his hands, which told her everything about what kind of visit this was going to be. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door before he knocked. He stopped when she opened it. He looked at her with the direct, uncomfortable look of a man who has rehearsed something and found, at the moment of delivery, that the rehearsal was inadequate. "Miss Dawson," he said. "Mr. Briggs," she said. He turned his hat in his hands once. "I spoke to Carter yesterday," he said. "He told me I could come." "I know," she said. William had told her the night before, quietly, giving her the choice of how to handle it. Roy looked at the ground and then back at her. "I said things," he said. "Did things. To make your work harder." He stopped. "It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right and I did it anyway, and then I let Driscoll's man put ideas in my head because they fit alongside what I'd already decided about you." He paused. "That's not an excuse. That's just the truth of it." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you decide?" she said. "Before I'd done anything. Before you'd spoken to me. Why did you decide I was a problem?" Roy was quiet. He turned his hat again. "Because Carter hadn't been himself since his wife died," he said. "And things ran a certain way. And I knew how things ran." He looked at her. "And you came in and you changed how things ran. And it worked better than the way I'd been doing it, and I didn't know what to do with that." She had not expected him to be that honest. She could see it cost him something. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I don't want your appreciation," he said, and then caught himself and said more quietly, "I mean, I'm not saying it to get something from you. I'm saying it because it's owed." She looked at him for another moment. Behind her, she could hear the kitchen, the stove going, something she had on for the noon meal, the ordinary sounds of the work that had become her life. "The ranch is better when it's full of people who want it to work," she said finally. "That's all I've ever been trying to do." Roy looked at her with the specific expression of a man absorbing something he's going to think about for a long time. He put his hat back on. "Carter offered me the position back," he said. "I told him I'd think on it." "What are you going to do?" Emma asked. "Think on it," he said. And the ghost of something that might have been humor crossed his weathered face for just a moment, and Emma thought, there it is. There is the man underneath the wound. She had wondered. "The noon meal is in 2 hours," she said. "If you're still here." He looked at her. He understood what she was offering. "I might be," he said. "How was?" He sat at the end of the table with his hat on the bench beside him, and he ate what she put in front of him, and he didn't speak much. But before he left, he stopped at the kitchen door and said, "That's the best beef stew I've had since my mother's," and then walked out before she could respond, which she thought was probably exactly the right amount of Roy Briggs for one day. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out through the gate, and she thought about what her mother had always said about people who had wronged you. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for the part of you that would have to keep carrying it otherwise. She set it down and turned back to the stove and felt lighter than she had in weeks. The circuit judge signed the suspension order the morning after their night at the kitchen table. She learned this from Jesse, who had been in town when Aldridge got the confirmation and had ridden back fast enough that his horse was still blowing when he came through the gate. "It's done," Jesse said, half through the kitchen door. "Driscoll can't move on the east pasture, not while the marshal's office is investigating." Emma nodded. She had known it was coming. She had still needed to hear it. "Where's William?" she asked. "Barn," Jesse said. "I'm going right now." He went. She stayed at the stove because the stove still needed watching, and there was still a ranch to feed, and the work didn't pause for good news any more than it paused for bad. She heard William's voice from the yard a few minutes later, and then his step in the hallway, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, and she turned around and looked at him. And what she saw on his face was not celebration. He wasn't a man who celebrated, but something quieter and more genuine than celebration. The specific look of someone who has held something together under enormous pressure and has just been told they can let their hands relax slightly. "It's done," he said. "Jesse told me," she said. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the work table, the way he had been sitting at the work table for nearly 2 months now, the way it had become the most natural thing in the world. This large, weathered rancher sitting in a kitchen that smelled of whatever Emma was making and talking to her about the things that mattered. "The marshal's office wants a full accounting," he said. "Everything Driscoll did in this county. I'm going to need to put together documentation." He looked at her. "The receipts you kept, the notes from the clerk's office, Jesse and Hector's account of the survey stakes." "I have everything," Emma said. "I'll put it together tonight." He looked at her steadily. You've been putting things together since you got here, he said. The ranch, the men. He paused. Me. She turned back to the stove because she needed to check what was on it, and also because some things were easier to receive when you weren't looking directly at them. The ranch put itself together, she said. It just needed someone to cook for it. Emma, he said. She turned. Stop doing that, he said. It was gentle, but direct. Stop making yourself smaller than you are. I've watched you do it for 2 months. Every time someone gives you credit, you give it back. She looked at him. My mother taught me not to need too much recognition, she said. Your mother taught you a lot of useful things, he said. That one you can put down. She was quiet for a moment. Then, despite everything, that might be the most words you've said to me at one time that weren't about the ranch. Something moved across his face that was unmistakably, finally, a real smile. Not the ghost of one. Not the almost version she'd been seeing for weeks. A real one, and it changed his entire face. And she understood immediately why it had taken this long. A smile like that was not a small thing on William Carter's face. It was an event. I'm working on it, he said. She turned back to the stove before he could see what his face had just done to hers. The days that followed had a different quality than anything that had come before. The immediate threat was suspended, the investigation was underway, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that was still hard work, always hard work, but without the particular tension of something dangerous moving just outside the edges of what you could see. Emma felt it in the dining room at meals, in the way the men breathed differently, in the way conversations lasted longer and went further before the day's demands pulled everyone back to their work. She felt it in herself, too. The specific lightness of a person who has been braced for a long time and has finally been given permission to unbrace. She cooked differently that week. Not better. She didn't think she could cook better than she already did, which was not vanity, but simply her mother's pragmatism applied to her own abilities. But differently. More freely. She tried things she'd been holding back. Recipes from the later pages of her mother's book, the ones her mother had marked for special occasions, and when there is time to do it right. She made a honey cake on Wednesday that had the dining room silent for a full minute after the first bite. She made a slow-roasted pork on Friday that Doc declared was the best thing he had eaten in Montana, which Hector disputed on the grounds that the beef stew earlier in the week held the title, and the argument lasted through dessert and was still going when they cleared the table. She wrote all of it in the notebook. The successful versions, and the ones that needed adjustment, and the ones that worked better for a big group than a small one. She was building something. She understood that now not as a vague sense, but as a specific, concrete reality. She was building a record. Her mother's book plus her own additions. 2 generations of cooking and caring for people, accumulated in one place. One evening, she was sitting at the work table working through the notebook when William came in and sat across from her and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You always ask if you can ask," she said. "You can always ask." "The recipe book," he said. "Your additions to it. Are you going to—" He stopped, started again. "What are you going to do with it eventually?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the familiar gesture. "Your mother built a restaurant around those recipes. You grew up in that kitchen. That's not something you just give up on because a bank took one building." She was quiet. "I've been thinking about the dining room," he said, "about what it's become, about how many people have been through here in the past 2 months, and not just ranch hands. The man from the Pierce property came by last week to thank me for sending information to the sheriff about his mother's situation, and he stayed for dinner, and he told 2 men in Mill Haven about the meal." He looked at her. "I've had 3 people ask me already who cooks here." Emma set down her pencil. "What are you saying?" she said. "I'm saying," William said carefully, "that Carter Ranch has a dining room that seats 40, and a cook who could fill it every night if she chose to, and a location on the main road between Mill Haven and Helena that sees enough traffic that word would spread." He paused. "I'm saying that what your mother built, what you lost, maybe it doesn't have to stay lost." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're talking about opening the ranch to outside diners," she said. "I'm talking about giving you back what was taken from you," he said. "In a different form. In a better location." He stopped. "If you wanted it." She stood up from the work table, and she walked to the window, and she stood there looking out at the Montana night, because she needed a moment with her back to him, needed the space of that moment to feel everything the offer contained without showing all of it on her face at once. Her mother's restaurant. The table she'd watched strangers carry out on a Thursday afternoon while she stood on the sidewalk with the recipe book in her arms. "It wouldn't be the same," she said. "No," William said. "It would be different. It would be yours in a different way." He paused. "And it wouldn't just be the cooking. I want to be clear about that. I'm not. This isn't me offering you a business arrangement." She turned around. He was looking at her with the fully open face, the one she had earned over 63 days, the one that had been worth every hour of the earning. "Then what is it?" she said. "It's me telling you," he said, "that I want you to have everything. Not just a job, not just a kitchen." He paused, and she could see him working against his own difficulty with words, the same way he'd worked against it at the work table 2 nights ago, but with less resistance now, as if the practice was making it easier. "I want you to have a home. I want this to be your home. Yours, not as an employee. Yours as—" He stopped. He looked at his hands, then he looked back at her. "I'm not good at the speech part of this," he said. "William," she said. "I'm trying to ask you to marry me," he said. "That's what I'm trying to do. Apparently, I need to walk through the entire territory before I get there." The kitchen was very quiet. Emma looked at him. The man at the ranch gate on a July morning, assessing her with that contained, careful look. The man who had whispered, "Who are you?" across a dining room full of men who had just been fed for the first time in months. The man who had left wildflowers on the work table without a note. The man who had followed her into the yard to face Driscoll and then told the sheriff, flatly and without embellishment, she found it. She thought about her mother, who had built a restaurant out of nothing and raised a daughter in the kitchen of it, and sent her out into the world with a recipe book and more preparation for difficulty than Emma had understood at the time. She thought about what her mother would say right now, if she were standing in this kitchen, looking at this man. She thought her mother would say, "Well, girl, what are you waiting for?" "Yes," Emma said. William looked at her. "Yes?" he said. "Yes," she said again. "You can stop walking through the territory." He stood up from the work table. He came around it and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to look at him, and he looked down at her with the open, undefended face and put his hand against her face, carefully, the way he'd picked up her mother's recipe book, with the instinct of someone handling something valuable. "I should have asked properly," he said. "With more." "William," she said. "Yes," he said. "You asked fine," she said. And for the second time in 2 months, she put her hand over his. What followed was not a quiet few weeks. The marshal's investigation into Harlan Driscoll moved faster than anyone had expected, partly because the Morrison family and the Pierce widow both came forward with their own accounts, and partly because when territorial investigators began pulling on the thread of Meridian Land Associates, they found it connected to a network of similar shell companies operating across 3 territories, all of them linked to a railroad speculation syndicate based in Chicago that had been buying corrupted corridor land for 18 months. Emma did not follow all the legal details. William did, because it was his land and his ranch, and he sat with his lawyer in the study for hours over several weeks going through documents and preparing statements. What Emma followed was the human part of it. The Pierce widow, a woman named Clara, who came to the ranch one afternoon with a basket of preserves she'd made as a thank you, and who stayed for coffee and then for dinner, and who told Emma over the kitchen table that she had been within a week of signing over her property when Aldridge's notice of investigation had arrived and stopped everything. "I didn't know what to do," Clara said. "My husband handled all of it, the legal side, and when he passed I thought I understood enough to manage, but Driscoll had lawyers, and I had—" She paused. "Nobody." "You had Aldridge," Emma said. "I had Aldridge because you had the presence of mind to look at a judicial seal number," Clara said. "The sheriff told me. He said a woman at Carter Ranch found the error." She looked at Emma directly. That was you." "It was," Emma said. Clara looked at her for a long moment. "How did you know to look?" "My mother taught me," Emma said. "She said fraud almost always has something wrong at the edges, because people who lie put their effort into the main story and get lazy with the details." Clara was quiet. Then, "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Emma said. "She would have liked you." Clara stayed through dinner, and Jessie found reasons to refill her coffee cup 3 times more than necessary, which Emma noted and filed away as information about Jessie that would become relevant later. After Clara left, Jessie stood in the kitchen doorway and said, elaborately casual, "She seems like a real nice woman." "She does," Emma said. "The Pierce property isn't far," Jessie said. "Only about 6 miles." "I know where it is," Emma said. "Wash up for dinner." He grinned and went. The formal charges against Harlan Driscoll and 2 members of his Chicago syndicate came down in late September. Emma learned about it the same way she'd learned about most things, from the men coming in from town with news, which she listened to over the dinner table and assembled into a complete picture from the pieces. Driscoll had left Montana Territory as advised, but the territorial marshal had a long arm and longer patience, and leaving had not been the protection he'd apparently imagined it would be. The East Pasture Lion was voided as part of the investigation's findings, fraudulently acquired, the court determined, because Driscoll's agent had pressured the original lien holder with information about the investigation that he had no right to and had used to manufacture a false urgency for the sale. The North Pasture water rights were never legitimately threatened. The forged documents had been exactly that, and the filing was expunged from the county record. Carter Ranch kept its water. Carter Ranch kept its land. Emma stood in the kitchen when William told her, and she felt it move through her. Not triumph, not the sharp, hot feeling of winning something, but something steadier and deeper. The feeling of ground that holds. "It's done," William said. "It is," she said. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she agreed. He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked back at him, and the kitchen held between them all of the things it had held since July. The first dinner, the 30 men at the table, the wildflowers on the windowsill, the work table conversations in the late night, the hand placed carefully near hers and then covered. "The dining room," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I've been thinking about it more," he said. "Seriously, the capacity, the road position. Word is already spreading. I've had 2 more people ask this week." He paused. "After the wedding, if you still want to." "I still want to," she said. The word wedding in the middle of an ordinary kitchen conversation, said the way William Carter said things, plainly, without fanfare, as if it were simply the name of the next true thing, landed differently than she would have expected. Not with the drama of a proposal or the weight of a decision still being made. With the specific quiet of something already settled, something she had already said yes to and he had already heard, and that now simply existed between them as fact. She had not thought, sitting in that rented room in Billings reading a letter by lamplight, that this was where the road went. She had thought about wages and work and a roof. She had thought about surviving one more season, putting one more piece back in place after the losses that had come in the preceding year. She had not thought about Montana or a ranch or a cowboy who would whisper, "Who are you?" with genuine bewilderment across a room full of men who had just been reminded that food was love made practical. She had not thought about any of it, and none of it had cared what she thought. It had simply been where she was going. The wedding was in October, when the Montana autumn had turned the hills the specific amber and gold that made the landscape look like something out of a story, which Emma thought was appropriate. The ceremony was small, in the ranch yard, with the men of Carter Ranch standing in the early afternoon light, and Jessie wearing a hat he'd clearly borrowed from someone, because it was slightly too large and kept shifting. Doc stood nearest to William, which was its own kind of ceremony. 11 years on the ranch, the oldest man there, standing at the shoulder of the man he'd served, and was now watching choose to be different than he'd been. Clara Pierce came. Jessie had ridden out to her property to deliver the invitation personally, which nobody commented on and everyone noticed. Roy Briggs came back. He had accepted William's offer of the position 3 weeks earlier, had come back quietly, and returned to the work without ceremony, and had spent those 3 weeks being different. Not transformed, because Roy Briggs was not a man who transformed, but different in the specific way of someone who has reckoned with something and adjusted accordingly. He spoke to Emma with the careful directness of a man watching his own words, and she met that directness with the same measure of it she would have given anyone, because she had set it down, and setting it down meant setting it down completely. He stood at the back of the gathering in the yard, at the edge where the men stood, and when the brief ceremony ended and William leaned down and kissed Emma for the first time in front of everyone, Roy Briggs put his fingers to his hat brim the same way Doc had, the same gesture, the old frontier acknowledgement. And Emma saw it from the corner of her eye, and it was enough. The dinner she made that evening for the wedding was the best meal she had ever cooked in her life. She knew it before she served it, the way she always knew. She had spent 2 days on it, calling on the furthest reaches of her mother's recipe book and the things she'd added to it herself. And the result was something that was neither her mother's cooking nor purely her own, but genuinely both. The accumulation of everything she'd learned in 31 years of feeding people who needed to be fed. The dining room was full. 40 people, which was more than the ranch had ever held for a meal, because William had opened the invitation beyond the hands to include the neighboring families. The men from Millhaven who had helped during the investigation, Clara Pierce and her son, the deputy who'd ridden with Aldridge. The room was loud and warm, and so full of people that it strained at its walls pleasantly, the way a good meal strains at the edges of what you think you can hold. Emma moved between the kitchen and the dining room, and she felt it the way she had felt it on the first night. The 30 men going quiet at the smell alone, the shoulders dropping, the faces changing, but larger now, fuller, with all the additional weight of knowing these people, knowing their stories, knowing which man's knee hurt when the weather changed, and which one wrote letters home that he never sent, and which young cowboy was falling for a widow 6 miles down the road. She knew them, and they knew her. That was the thing, she realized, standing for a moment in the kitchen doorway, looking at the full, loud, laughing dining room of Carter Ranch. That was the thing she had not expected and could not have planned for, and which had turned out to be the most important thing. Not the cooking, not the legal fight, not even the love, though the love was large and real, and hers in a way she was still learning the dimensions of. The knowing, the being known. She had arrived carrying a recipe book and the particular stubbornness of someone who has run out of options and decided to treat that as freedom. And somewhere between the first dinner and this one, in 63 days of cooking and listening and refusing to leave, and finding fraudulent seal numbers, and standing in yards, and sitting at work tables in the late night, she had become known. Completely. By 31 men and a sheriff and a widow named Clara and a young cowboy from Georgia who was going to figure out what he was looking for eventually. And by one hard, quiet, remarkable man who had whispered, "Who are you?" in a dining room, and spent 2 months finding out the answer. William appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him come up behind her. She had been too far inside the moment, and she startled slightly, and he put his hand on her shoulder, easy and certain, the hand of someone who has decided where it belongs. "You need anything?" he said. She looked at the dining room. Doc was telling a story that had half the table leaning in. Jesse was sitting directly across from Clara Pierce, and had managed to position himself that way, with the elaborate casualness of someone who thought nobody noticed. Roy Briggs was talking to the deputy from Aldridge's office, with the look of a man who has been given a second chance and is being careful with it. Hector was laughing at something Pete had said. Real laughter. The kind that happens when people feel safe enough to be loud. "No," Emma said. "I have everything." William looked at the room, and then at her, and she could feel the looking even without seeing it. "Come sit down," he said. "It's your wedding dinner. You're allowed to eat it." "In a minute," she said. "Emma," he said. "1 minute," she said. "Let me have 1 minute." He understood. He went back to the table. She stood in the doorway for that minute, and she let herself feel all of it. The room and the people and the food she'd made, and the Montana autumn outside the window, and the recipe book open on the kitchen work table behind her, with all the pages her mother had written, and all the pages she'd added, and all the pages still blank, waiting for what came next. She thought about the girl who had stood outside her mother's restaurant, watching strangers carry out the tables. She thought about the rented room in Billings and the letter by lamplight. She thought about the stagecoach north and the ranch gate, and the moment she'd put her mother's recipe book on the kitchen table and said "I know" to a man who didn't yet know who he was talking to. She thought about 63 days and everything they contained. Then she went and sat down at her own wedding dinner, beside her husband, at the table she had made possible in a home she had made hers, and she ate. The dining room of Carter Ranch opened to the public the following spring. Not immediately, and not all at once. Emma was practical about it, her mother's daughter in that as in everything, and she spent the winter months working out what it would take, and what it would mean, and how to do it right. She and William spent evenings at the work table going through it together, and she had come to love those evenings specifically. The two of them on either side of the table with papers and coffee and the lamp between them, planning the next version of what Carter Ranch was going to be. Word had spread through the winter without any effort on their part. The wedding dinner had been talked about in Millhaven for weeks, and the people who had been there told people who hadn't been. And by January, Emma was getting occasional requests from travelers on the main road who had heard there was something worth stopping for at Carter Ranch. She said yes to those travelers, carefully and selectively, and the selectiveness built its own reputation. You couldn't just arrive, you had to ask, and the asking meant something. It meant you understood you were coming to someone's home, not a hotel dining room, and that the meal you were going to receive was the real thing. By April, she had a full calendar for the spring season, and a waiting list that William had taken to calling, with his particular dry understatement, a problem we're grateful for. She hired 2 helpers from Millhaven, a woman named Agnes, who had been working in the hotel kitchen and who had the specific competence of someone who has spent years doing work that's beneath their ability and is thrilled to be doing something that matches it, and Agnes's teenage daughter Ruth, who was quick and eager and reminded Emma, in ways she chose not to examine too closely, of herself at that age. The kitchen became, in those spring months, something her mother would have recognized. Not the same kitchen, not the same restaurant, not the same Emma, 2 years and half a continent different from all of that, but the same essential thing. A place where work and care and feeding people who needed to be fed were all the same act, performed by someone who understood that cooking was never only about the food. On a morning in May, the first real warm morning of a Montana spring that had taken its time arriving, Emma stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the yard below. William was talking to Doc near the barn, both of them looking at something in the corral, the specific focused posture of ranchers evaluating an animal. Jesse was crossing from the bunkhouse toward the stable, and he paused when he saw the window and raised a hand, and Emma raised her coffee cup back. She was pregnant. She had known for 3 weeks and had told William 11 days ago, in the kitchen, at the work table, the way they told each other everything important now. Directly, late in the evening, with coffee between them. He had been very still for a moment, and then he had stood up and come around the table and put his arms around her, which was not something William Carter did easily or often. And he had held her without speaking for a long moment. And she had felt his breathing change and then steady. And she had thought, this is what he sounds like when something is too large for words. She had written it in her mother's recipe book that night. Not a recipe. Just the fact, and the date, and the feeling of the evening. Because her mother had taught her that what you write down is what you're saying matters. And she wanted to say it mattered. She wrote, May 1886. New. Everything new. She was still at the window when she heard Agnes come in behind her, the sound of someone settling into the kitchen with the ease of belonging in it, and then the sound of Ruth asking a question about something on the stove, and Agnes answering, and the kitchen coming to life around her with its particular morning sounds. She turned away from the window. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she loved it. Genuinely, the way you love the thing that is both what you do and who you are. She set down her coffee, and picked up her apron, and tied it, and opened her mother's recipe book to the morning's plan, and the kitchen filled with the sounds of preparation and the smell of things beginning. And outside the window, Montana was enormous, and green, and wide, and full of a summer that was just now arriving. Emma Dawson. Carter stood in the kitchen. She had made her own, and looked at the recipe book that held two women's handwriting and the story of everything they had learned about how to feed people who needed to be fed. And she thought about the woman who had arrived at a ranch gate with a suitcase and stubborn hands and her mother's recipes and not much else. And she thought about everything that woman had not known she was walking toward. She thought about the cowboy who had whispered, "Who are you?" in a room full of men who had just been given something they'd forgotten they needed. She knew the answer now. She had known it for a long time. She was the woman who stayed. The woman who listened when nobody thought she was listening, and remembered what nobody thought she'd remember. The woman who walked 4 miles to keep a ranch supplied and stood in a county clerk's office and read a document until she found what was wrong with it. The woman who had arrived with nothing and built something that lasted. A home, a table, a family, made from the particular alchemy of feeding people well, and caring for them truly, and refusing, absolutely and without apology, to be less than she was. She was Emma Dawson Carter, and this was her kitchen, and her dining room, and her table, and her ranch, and her husband who had asked who she was and spent the rest of his life grateful for the answer. And the woman who had once been told she was too much and not enough, and the wrong size for the life she wanted had become, in the end, exactly the right size for the life she built. Because a person's worth was never measured by what they carried when they arrived. It was measured by what they made of where they stayed. And Emma Carter had made everything.